So me and my girlfriend were out by the reserve just outside of Sussex, New Jersey, yesterday evening. The sun was barely touching the horizon, giving everything that flat, dying orange light that happens before dusk. We wanted to hit the trail that cuts through the woods near the old reservoir, a spot that we'd been a dozen times before, but this time it felt off the second that we stepped off the gravel and into the tree line. The woods there are usually a mess of brambles and deadfall, but yesterday the undergrowth was unnervingly sparse. The trees were tall, spaced almost perfectly, like someone had come through with a measuring tape to line them up. It was dead silent. No birds, no rustle of squirrels, not even the usual hum of wind through the branches. About 20 minutes in, we both just stopped as well. Right in the center of the path was a bird, a blue jay, or what should have been one. It was curled up in a tight, awkward ball. The thing was completely impossibly black, though. Not just dark or in a shadow, but like it had been spray-painted with matte black ink. There was no smell, and despite the warm air, the thing looked bone dry. I leaned in expecting to see ants or flies working on it, but there was nothing. It was just an empty, dark husk sitting on the dirt. My girlfriend then grabbed my arm, her grip digging in, and she looked pale, like she had just been hit in the gut or something. I didn't have to ask, though, because I felt it too. A heavy, tight pressure radiating from the center of my chest. And then it was like the air had suddenly dropped 10 degrees and got twice as thick. We didn't say a word. We just turned around and started heading back. The light was fading faster than it felt like it should have, and by the time that we were halfway back, the path behind us was already swallowed by a weird, sort of purple haze. And that was when we heard it. It started as a high, thin sound, a woman's voice, sharp and frantic, calling out for help. It sounded like it was maybe 50 yards behind us, but we kept moving, faster now, not wanting to run, but certainly wanting to be anywhere else but here. The voice, it didn't get quieter too. It shifted. 1 second it was like almost right on our heels, and then it sounded like it was coming from the treetops to our left. Then suddenly it was muffled, like it was being shouted from inside of a tunnel. The pacing was all wrong too. It wasn't the sound of someone walking behind us. It was like the sound itself was sort of popping in and out of existence, jumping between points in the woods. I never really believed in the old stories that my grandmother told me back home when I used to live with her, about things that mimic voices to pull you off the trail. But as we were speed walking toward the edges of the field, that same sound kept playing the same trick, getting louder when we were already ahead and then sounding miles away just as we were looking back. We broke out into the field, and the silence immediately snapped back into place. The crickets, they started up again. A car rattled by on the road in the distance, and the voice was now gone. We didn't talk about it until we got to the car because we were running so hard. We decided then and there, though, that we were not going to go back into those woods, not even when the sun was high, ever again, because there's certainly a difference between a weird noise and a weird noise that feels like it's hunting you, and this was definitely the latter. I was 22, living in a cramped, drafty rental in the suburbs. It was May. My life was a mess of academic burnout and the kind of crushing, hollow loneliness that always happens when you're 20 and convinced that you're going nowhere. I'd been spending my nights up late, reading texts about theology, trying to find some kind of structure to anchor my thoughts. I remember one Tuesday, the anxiety was so bad that I was literally shaking. I sat on the edge of my mattress, staring at the dust motes dancing in the moonlight, and just whispered a request. I asked for a sign, for an exit, for anything other than the static in my head. I don't know when I actually fell asleep, but the transition was sharp. I was standing in the hallway that felt infinite, lit by a white, sterile intensity that didn't cast shadows. It felt like I was being scrubbed clean from the inside out. No fear, no desire, just a flat, heavy silence. I blinked and I was back in my bedroom. But the light was still there. The room was bathed in an even pale glow as if the moon had been dragged inside. The silence in the room was absolute. It felt like the air had turned into glass. I wasn't waking up. I was sliding into a different state of reality, it felt. Then, the bedroom door, which I knew that I had clicked shut, groaned on its hinges. It wasn't a gentle push. It was struck from the outside, a sudden whack of wood against the frame that sent a shiver through the floorboards. A shape moved out of the room. It was dense, darker than the night, like a hole punch through the pale light filling the hallway. It didn't have legs or arms. It was just a smudge of absolute black that glided away toward the kitchen. The second that it cleared the threshold, the white light in my room died, collapsing into the usual murky grey of a suburban night. My heart didn't just thump, it almost felt like it stopped. I felt a cold, jagged spike of adrenaline hit my spine, and I finally lunged for my phone. It was 3 a.m. I lay there for hours, my eyes glued to the crack of the door, waiting for the black smudge to come back, but it never did. Months later, I was talking to the woman who lived next door, a lifelong resident of the street. She was watering her roses and mentioned, almost as an aside, that the previous tenant of my place had been found in the pantry years after the fact. She said that the man had been obsessed with the same religious text that I'd been studying. She stopped talking then, looked at my front door and said, "He never really left the structure of that house, I think." I moved out 2 weeks later. I really don't know what all that was, but I still see that black smudge in my peripheral vision when I'm exhausted from time to time, but I never look at it. I just turn on the lights and make sure that the door is locked. What I can say, though, is that after that night, the anxiety left me, and really, I've never felt better. I was 10 years old in the summer of 1994, living on a sprawling, isolated acreage. My father, he ran a small-scale poultry operation. Nothing fancy, just a few hundred free-range birds protected by wire mesh coops, really. He was a man of patterns, though, and he knew his flock like he knew his own hands. When the birds started vanishing, though, he didn't just count the loss. He tracked the method. Now, this was not a normal predator attack. No feathers were left, no blood, and no signs of scavenging, too. Each bird was gone, but the coop doors remained latched, and the fine-gauge wire was never breached. The only thing left behind was a series of perfectly circular, charred-looking indents in the dirt, arranged in an irregular row leading away from the coop toward the tree line. My father spent 3 nights sitting on the porch, nursing a coffee and a shotgun, but he never saw a thing. Then, on the 4th night, the dogs went absolutely silent. And that was the most unsettling part, really. I mean, usually if a fox or something else was out there, they'd be howling the house down. Instead, though, they retreated under the farmhouse, whimpering and refusing to come out, even when my father called. Around 2 a.m, there was this weird sound. It wasn't mechanical, but it sounded more like a really weird sort of thrumming sound. It almost sounded like somebody had got some speakers, dropped the bass down to absolute limit, and just had them going like that for, I don't know, maybe 5-10 minutes. My father grabbed his torch and went out, and I was right behind him, huddled in the doorway. We tracked the sound through the coop, and as the beam of his torch cut through the night, it hit something standing near the feed shed. It was about 4 feet tall, standing upright, with skin that looked wet or grey like riverstone. It wasn't wearing clothes, at least I don't think it was. but it had a sort of strange boxy shape to its torso, and its limbs were long and thin. At the time, I had no idea what it was, but now that I know about grey aliens and all that, I'm telling you that that's pretty much what this thing was, although a little bit different. It was hunched over, though, clutching one of the hens to its chest. When the light hit it, it didn't scramble or scatter. It turned its head toward us. It didn't seem to have a mouth, but just sort of where one should have been, or maybe it did, but it was so small that it could barely be seen. It had huge black eyes, and they were mesmerizing. It stood there for a heartbeat, its limbs rigid, and then it moved. It didn't run. It sort of propelled itself forward with a sort of jerky, unnatural momentum, clearing the 6-foot fence of the boundary paddock without even touching the top wire. My father raised the rifle, but he didn't fire in the end. He told me later that it was because the thing had moved with such startling, fluid intent that he was suddenly terrified of what might happen if he missed. We tracked it to the edge of the creek line, where the reeds are tall and the terrain gets pretty swampy. My father kept the light trained on the ground, expecting to see footprints, but the mud was undisturbed. The creature had essentially vanished into thin air. Interestingly enough as well, we never lost another bird after that. The charred indents in the ground eventually filled in with dirt, and the dogs went back to being their usual aggressive selves. My father never talked about it again after that, and neither did I, really. I'll never forget that night for as long as I live, because it was the moment in time where I really realized that there was something more to life. Whether you call that spiritual, other dimensions, or anything like that, I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm certainly more open to the possibilities of things than I was before that. So my grandmother's house in suburban Ohio had been a museum of her own neurosis for like 40 years. Every doily, every ceramic figurine, every stack of magazines, it was all positioned with a precision that bordered on the hostile. When she died last winter, the house, it actually passed to me, and I hired a contractor, a guy named Miller, who had been remodeling homes in this county since the late 80s, to get it ready for sale. I wanted the place stripped bare, basically. So we pulled out the floral wallpaper, tore up the shag carpet, and gutted the kitchen. For the first 2 months, it was just the smell of sawdust and stale tobacco. I wasn't there during the day, just checking in on Tuesday and Friday afternoons to see how the billing was holding up. It was mid-March, though, when Miller finally pulled me aside. We were standing in what used to be the dining room, now just a hollow box of bare studs and subfloor. He looked tired, but not the I've been working 10 hours a day kind of tired, but the I haven't slept in a week sort of thing. Look, he said, rubbing the back of his neck, my guys are starting to ask for hazard pay or they're going to walk. He laid it out for me, matter of fact, like he was reporting a structural flaw. He said that every time that the house went quiet, the temperature in the crawl space and the upstairs landing would plummet. He said that they had been working in the basement, pulling copper wire, when they heard the distinct sound of heavy porcelain plates being stacked in the dining room table directly above them. We go up there, Miller said, but there's nothing there, not even a dust bunny. Then there was the tapping. He claimed that throughout the day, there was this tapping or knocking sound that would come from inside of the walls. It wasn't the erratic pop of heating ducts or the settling of timber. They checked that. This was deliberate. 3 knocks on the northern wall and then a pause, then 3 knocks on the southern wall. I didn't believe him. I told him that it was the age of the house, the expansion of the wood, the drafts and all that. He didn't argue, though. He just handed me a roll of painter's tape and told me to sit in the kitchen for an hour and listen. So I did. I sat there for 20 minutes. The kind of silence that rings in your ear a little bit. But then, from the hallway, I heard it. A sharp, clear drop sound, like a heavy book being dropped on the carpet. I walked out, flashlight in hand, and scanned the hallway. Empty. I walked into the living room. Empty as well. When I turned back toward the kitchen, that was when my breath hitched. One of the drop cloths that I had left on the floor, it had been moved. It was no longer a crumpled heap. Instead, it was folded neatly and perfectly into a square, right in the center of the doorway. I didn't say anything to Miller. I just told him to finish the painting and that I would give him a bonus to get it done by the weekend. I'm the only one left in the house now. I spent the last 2 nights sleeping on a mattress in the living room, and the first night was fine. But last night, I woke up at 3 because of the sound of a tea kettle whistling. Mind you, I don't even have a kettle plugged in. I'm still using a hot plate on the floor, and I walked into the kitchen, and the sound literally stopped the moment that I turned that corner. I have never experienced anything like this before in my entire life, and I have no idea what to make of it all. I guess that's why I'm here too, because, well, I have to sell this place, but I want to do something about this. If this is a spirit or a ghost or something, well, how do you get rid of it? I was living in a duplex in Boulder, Colorado, back in the spring of 2022. I just finished my sophomore year and was staying through the summer to finish up a lab credit. It was a cheap, drafty place with thin walls and a landlord who didn't care about anything as long as the check cleared. My bedroom was at the back of the house, right up against a trellis that was completely choked with dead ivy. One Tuesday, sometime early in the morning, I woke up because the room felt really weird, like the air had turned into static. I didn't reach for my phone, I just laid there instead, staring at the closet door that I knew that I'd pulled shut before bed, because it was now hanging open 4 inches, showing nothing but a slice of pitch black interior. I figured that the latch was just loose. I rolled out of bed, stepped over to the closet, and gave it a solid shove until it clicked. The moment that I got back into bed, though, I heard it. The closet door suddenly swung open again, and this time, it sounded like something came out of it. It sounded like a heavy piece of meat hitting the carpet inside the closet, then a sliding sound over the carpet. I didn't move. My head was literally buried in the pillow, and I was focusing entirely on my breathing so that I wouldn't make any sound. The sliding then stopped, and for a solid minute, there was just silence. Then I heard a whisper. It wasn't loud, and it didn't sound like it was coming from the closet. Instead, it sounded like it was right against the back of my neck. "Still here" is what I heard. I reached under my bed, grabbed the flashlight that I kept for emergencies, and swung it toward the closet in one motion. The door, as I assumed, was wide open. The shelves were empty, though, just as I left them. But the back wall, the one that shared the space with the outside trellis, was covered in a fine, thick layer of well, I don't know what it was, but it sort of looked like frost. And right there in the center of this frost were 5 distinct long-fingered handprints pressed deep into the drywall, the tips pointed downward. I didn't put on shoes. I just grabbed my keys, walked out the front door, and I sat in my car until the sun came up. I didn't go back inside that duplex for 3 days, in fact. And when I finally did return with a couple of friends to pack my stuff, the frost was gone, but the wall where those prints had been was now warped and sort of discolored, like somebody had taken a blowtorch to the paint. I never found out what had been in that closet, and honestly, I don't even want to. I just know that for the rest of that summer, I slept with the lights on. I've moved 4 times since then, and every single room that I pick now has an open concept wardrobe. I don't care how messy it looks. I just need to be able to see that back wall at all times. So I'm currently living in a cramped 2-bedroom flat in a working-class neighborhood in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I share it with my sister and her 3-year-old. My father passed away about 3 weeks ago, and the lease is up at the end of the month, so we've been living in a state of just constant frantic packing. The place is honestly a maze of boxes at the moment. My father's old room is at the end of a short, narrow passage. Since he died, that location of the apartment feels weird, almost like it's pressurized, or makes my ears pop whenever I walk toward the door to grab a crate or something. It all started, though, with a weird smell, a sharp chemical scent like old hair tonic and bitter coffee maybe, the exact brand that he used to buy actually. My sister kept insisting that she'd spilled something, but we both knew that the cupboard was empty. Then there were some sounds, almost like leather-soled shoes on the ceramic floor. It would go from his room down the passage and stop right at the threshold of my room. I would always look out expecting to see my sister, but the hallway was always empty. The breaking point, though, was on Wednesday. So I was alone in the flat. The rest of the building was loud, neighbors shouting, music playing, the usual chaos of the streets outside here. I was sitting on my bed, tapping a box when I heard my full name, first and second name, called out from the hallway. Now, it wasn't muffled. It was sharp, clear, and carried a tone of almost tired impatience that I knew better than my own reflection. I stood up, my pulse hitting the base of my throat so hard that I could feel the thud in my ears. I walked into the hall. "Dad?" Nothing. Just the refrigerator in the kitchen. I checked the front door. It was bolted. I checked the windows, latched. When I turned back toward his room, the door, which I had explicitly shut and jammed with a heavy plastic crate earlier that morning, was now wide open. The floor inside was covered in dust from plaster that had shaken loose from the ceiling, but there were no footprints that I could see in it. I didn't go in, though. I backed away, grabbed the keys, and I didn't stay another night in that house in the city center. My sister started sleeping in my room, though, dragging her mattress across the floor so that we could share the space at one point. She won't talk about the noises, but I've seen her jump when the hallway floorboards creak, and she keeps the light in the main room burning until dawn. We had a local woman come by yesterday to say some prayers and burn some sage, but the house still feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I'm moving out in 4 days, and I've started leaving the lights on in the passageway, and I keep my door locked when I'm in there, not because I think a lock will keep anything out, but because I guess the physical barrier of the metal, it just makes me feel a little bit more separate from whatever's inside. And quite honestly, at this point, I just want the key handover to be over so that I can walk out that door and never have to wonder who's pacing the hallway behind me ever again. When I was about 6 years old, we lived in an old farmhouse in rural Manitoba, the kind that creaks in the wind and has a basement that always was damp. My bedroom was on the ground floor, right off of the main mudroom. It had a heavy oak door that stuck in the frame, required a solid shove to latch it shut, and I was an only child. So I spent hours mapping out the house, playing little games where I had to move from room to room without touching the floorboards that squeaked, things like that. One overcast day, in autumn I think it was, I was playing my travel game, moving through the kitchen and into the mudroom. I went to pull the latch on the mudroom door, but it was already partially ajar, swinging with a slow motion. I looked through the gap, and standing in the center of the mudroom, facing the back door, was a person. At least it had the general structure of a person. Shoulders, arms, legs. But it was covered entirely in thick, uneven layers of moldy burlap, like a scarecrow that had been stripped from a field and stitched back together in a hurry. It stood dead still, and its head was slightly cocked to the side, as if it were listening for a sound that I couldn't hear. I was young, of course, but I knew that what I was seeing just wasn't right. The atmosphere around the figure looked blurry too, like heat rising off of a highway. I didn't scream. I just sort of stood there, my hands frozen on the doorframe, watching as this thing turned its head. That's when I noticed that there were no eyes. There was no nose, just a cluster of what looked like really weird, dried, twisted straw poking through a tear of the fabric, if that's even what you would call it. It moved toward me, though, not walking, but sliding. And upon seeing that, I bolted. I scrambled into the living room and found my father working at his desk. I told him that there was a monster in the mudroom, a man made of rags. He didn't get angry. He just stood up, grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and told me to stay put. He was gone for maybe 3 minutes, and when he came back, he looked pale, his hands trembling as he set the poker down. He walked straight to the back door, checked the deadbolt, and then he checked the mudroom latch. He stood there for a long time, staring at the dust on the floor. "There's no one here," he said, his voice sort of tight. "But the back door was open and there's dirt everywhere." There were no footprints leading away from the house, and the soft mud outside of the back step was undisturbed, as if the door had been opened from the inside by something that didn't need to step across the threshold. My mother always said that it was the isolation and the harsh winters that made me imagine things, but she never did explain why they sold the farmhouse for half of its value in the end, or why my father spent the next 3 years sleeping with a shotgun under his bed. I try not to talk about it, to be honest, but every now and then I'll be in a thrift store and catch the smell of that sort of damp burlap, and immediately I'm 6 years old again, standing in that doorway, waiting for something that shouldn't be real to turn its head and to look at me. My partner and I moved into a sleek 4-story apartment block in Seattle, Washington, back in early 2025. It's one of those modern luxury builds, glass, exposed steel, and walls so thin that you can hear the neighbors sneeze. You expect that kind of place to be sterile, boring, and quiet. And for the first few months, it really was. But then things started happening that didn't make any sense, always when we were home and things were quiet. Last Thursday, I walked out of the bedroom and saw my partner's keys standing vertically on the windowsill, for instance. The sill, it's maybe 2 inches wide. Honestly, too, I didn't think too much of it until she walked out behind me and asked why I'd done it. I tried to stand them up myself as well, just to see if it was possible, because I assumed that she had done it, but they kept clattering flat onto the wood. The window was locked, mind you, and we're on the 3rd floor, away from the street noise, so I don't even know how somebody could get up and do something like that. Then there was the kitchen incident. So we have these shallow floating shelves over the stove. There's also a heavy framed print that has been propped against the backsplash for months now. And one day, while I was rinsing dishes and she was sitting at the island, the frame literally just lifted and was pitched forward. It didn't slide and it didn't tip. I mean, it cleared the spice jars that were sitting directly in front of it and landed perfectly flat on the counter. It was like somebody had gripped the top of the frame and sort of pushed it out and then placed it on the counter. I'm a pragmatist and I like to think of myself as a pretty reasonable person, but that one, I still scratch my head about. The stuff at the dining table, though, is what really gets to me. So we were playing cards with my brother and his girlfriend on a Saturday at some point. My brother's vape pen was sitting in the middle of the table, nowhere near the edge, and without a single person touching the table, the thing just literally launched itself off the surface, did a clean half-turn in the air, and literally landed on his lap. Nobody moved upon seeing it. We all just stared at it, and sort of at each other. I spent the next half hour checking the table for a slant, but it's perfectly level, and obviously that doesn't explain how this thing could break the laws of physics and sort of go one way in midair and come back again. It's the small annoying sort of physical stuff that's wearing us down the most though. My partner called me into the bathroom 3 times last month because she swore that the plunger was rocking back and forth on the tile like a pendulum. Every time that I ran in there, it was dead still though. Then there's the phantom voices that we're hearing. Like, I'll be in the kitchen and hear her call my name from the bedroom, but when I walk in, she's sitting there with the noise-cancelling headphones on, watching a movie. She's had the same thing happen to her too, hearing me call her from rooms that I haven't been in for like hours. We've tried to normalize the whole thing a little bit. We blame the ventilation the most, or just sleep deprivation, but none of that really explains why a heavy frame bypasses objects on a shelf, or why keys refuse to fall over when you stand them on their edge, or how the laws of physics are literally broken. I haven't told the landlord. I mean, what do I say? That the flat is fine, but the objects in it have a mind of their own? I'm literally stuck here for another 9 months, and I just keep the lights on a little later and try not to look too closely at the shelves when I walk past them. It's not that the flat feels evil or whatever, but it just sort of feels like it's being occupied by something that's bored and messing with our stuff for the most part. And so, have any of you guys ever experienced anything like this? And if you have, what did you do about it? So I'm 26 and I live in Akron, Ohio, in a pretty standard 2-bedder above a dry cleaner. But nothing about the place is really off day to day. My older brother Danny lives with me too, but he works overnight shifts at a packaging plant about 3 nights a week, so on those nights, I'm alone. This happened on one of those nights too. It was a Thursday, pretty normal day overall. I ordered pizza, watched a show, fell asleep at around 1 in the morning, and there was no stress, no weird mood, nothing that would make me think anything unusual was coming. I woke up in a way that felt wrong immediately though. Not like a normal I'm awake sort of transition. It felt like my mind came online before my body did, and I was fully aware, eyes open, but I had that heavy delayed feeling like my body hadn't caught up yet. I was on my back, which was already unusual for me because I always sleep on my side. The first thing that I noticed though was that the ceiling stain above my bed, it's been there since we moved in, and it's kind of shaped like a distorted outline of Texas if you look at it long enough. I've stared at it a lot just out of habit, so my brain locked onto it because it was familiar, but it was sort of moving all of a sudden. And then I noticed that the building was quiet in a way that it usually isn't. There's a guy downstairs who plays a guitar at random hours. It's not loud, but you can definitely hear it through the floor sometimes. That night, it stopped abruptly. No fading out, no last note, just kind of a cut-off mid-sound. It was sudden enough, too, that I remember thinking that he might have just stopped paying attention and muted the strings or something. Right after that, though, I noticed my closet door. I had definitely closed it before going to bed. I always do that. It helps me sleep, but now it was slightly open, maybe a few inches. Not wide enough to see everything inside, but just enough that there was a visible dark gap there. My first thought was that Danny had come home early and gone into my room for something. That seemed like the simplest explanation, so I sat there for a bit trying to confirm that idea in my head and watching this stain above me still moving, thinking that maybe I was just tired or seeing things. But I already knew something just didn't quite match up. I just felt it. I checked his car earlier that night before sleeping, in fact, like I normally do, and it wasn't there. Parking in our lot is pretty tight, so I always glance out before bed just to avoid getting blocked in the morning. So I was pretty confident that I was alone in the apartment. And I also remember very clearly that the closet wasn't just open. It felt like something was inside of the gap. That's the only way that I can describe it. Not visually at first, but mentally. Like my brain picked up on something being present before I fully understood what I was looking at. The darkness in that opening, it felt denser than it should have, like it wasn't just an empty space. I tried to move or call out, but it just didn't come out properly. It wasn't paralysis exactly, but my body just wasn't responding the way that it normally would. More like delayed commands than full control. And that was when I saw movement inside of the closet gap. It wasn't something stepping out normally, and the door didn't open wider. It just didn't seem to matter, in fact. The shape sort of came forward without the opening changing, like the space itself wasn't limiting it. It was tall, but the proportions didn't register correctly. My brain kept trying to recategorize it as a person, but it didn't fit cleanly into that idea. There was no clear face or defined limbs that I could make out properly in the dark. It moved across the room in a straight line and stopped at the side of my bed. As soon as it did, it felt like I was in an icebox. It also felt localized, like the space around this thing was colder by default. That part stood out to me more than anything else too, for some reason. It stayed there for a bit. I don't know exactly how long because I wasn't checking the time, obviously, but I just remember focusing on the ceiling again because I didn't want to look directly at this thing. At some point, it leaned in and placed what felt like 2 fingers on the upper part of my chest, near my collarbone. It wasn't pressure or force. It was more like contact without intention, like it was checking something or confirming something physically. And then, all of a sudden, this black sort of mist, or black shadow, or whatever it was just gone. No movement away, no fading, just literally not there anymore. And right after that, my body literally snapped back into full control, and I sat up immediately, turning on every light that I could reach, and I stayed like that until morning. When Danny came home in the morning, I was still sitting upright in bed, fully awake. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him exactly what had happened. He didn't joke about it or dismiss it too. He just listened, then went straight to the closet and checked it himself. He stood there for a bit, closed it, and didn't really say anything after that. That week, he started coming home more often, even on nights that he wasn't scheduled to be off. He didn't explain it, and I didn't ask. But a few days later, I noticed something else. I had faint marks on my upper chest near the collarbone area. Not deep bruising, but just sort of light discoloration that looked like pressure points. A little bit yellow, if anything. I checked for any possible physical cause, like sleeping position, clothing, anything that I could reasonably link to it, but nothing fit cleanly. I did take a photo of it, mostly to track it, thinking that it might fade or change or something, and I still have that, but I've looked at it more times than I should have, trying to convince myself that there's a normal explanation, that I'm just missing somewhere here. So far, though, I genuinely haven't found one that fully holds up without forcing it. I spent a week last September doing solo survey work in a national forest in Montana. It's rugged, high-elevation terrain, miles of heavy timber and limestone shelves that haven't seen a maintained trail in decades. My job was pretty simple. Mark out a potential timber harvest block, map the drainage, and get back to the truck before the snow started falling. The weather that day was miserable. It was a constant freezing drizzle that soaked through my gear pretty quickly, and the forest floor was a mess of slick moss and rotted logs. I must have been about 4 miles in, deep in a valley that wasn't even marked on the USGS maps, when the atmosphere just suddenly folded. I was moving along a contour line when I tripped over something buried in the mud. I cleared away the pine needles and realized that it was a stone slab, hand-carved with a name on it that I didn't recognize. I figured that it must have been an older homestead's grave, but as I stood up, I saw another one, then another one. They weren't in rows. They formed a tight, perfect circle about 20 feet across. The center of the circle was just bare, churned-up dirt, devoid of any plant growth, despite the surrounding forest being choked with ferns and brush. I pulled out my compass though to get a bearing on the drainage, but the needle was absolutely wild in this location. It wasn't just drifting, it was spinning in a slow, deliberate circle, like it was caught in a whirlpool or something. I tapped the housing, thinking maybe that the fluid had leaked, but it just wouldn't settle. And that's when I heard some snapping. It sounded like a heavy branch being broken. Then there was another one, rhythmic and paced. It was coming from the edge of the circle. I swung my head around, my boots sliding in the mud, but there was nothing, just the grey, wet trunks of the pines. Then I saw it. About 30 yards out, there was a silhouette standing between two hemlocks. It was impossibly tall, and its limbs were too long, hanging down to its knees at least. It wasn't standing on the ground, too. It honestly looked like it was wedged between the trees, its body sort of contorted to fit the space. I didn't yell. I didn't reach for my radio. I just turned and I started walking. The pacing started immediately. Whatever it was, it began moving parallel with me, just outside of my range of vision. Every time that I stepped over a log, I heard a very heavy crunch in the brush to my left. Every time that I stopped, the sound of movement would cease a few seconds later, followed by the wet rustle of leaves. It wasn't an animal. Animals move sporadically, or they freeze. Whatever this was, it was tracking me, and it was matching my pace, staying in the blind spots behind the thicker stands of the timber. I picked up the pace at this point. I was stumbling over hidden roots, my lungs burning in the freezing air, not daring to look behind me. I could hear it breathing, though. Not a ragged animal breath, but a low sort of wheeze that seemed to vibrate the air around my ears a little bit. It sounded like the air was escaping from a puncture maybe or something. I reached the gravel access road after what felt like hours of just dead sprinting through the brush. The moment that my boot hit the loose stone of the road, the sounds suddenly stopped. Total, absolute silence. I walked the remaining 3 miles back to my truck in a really weird state. My hands were shaking so violently that I couldn't get the key into the ignition on the first try. I didn't report it. I didn't mention the graves, the compass, or the thing in the timber. I just finished my shift, packed up my gear, and drove until I hit the interstate. I'm back in the office now, doing grid data analysis, but I'm convinced, too, that the needle, it didn't break. It was trying to tell me that the magnetic north of that valley was somewhere else entirely. I have to go back out into the deep woods again at some point, and after this, honestly, I'm kind of dreading it. I grew up on the edge of a mid-sized town in the county of Durham, where the housing estates abruptly drop off into ancient, neglected woodland for miles. My friends and I spent every weekend in those trees during the spring of 2022. It was a local tradition to head into the scrub, build a fire, and drink until the early hours. I'm a structural technician by trade, so I'm used to reading environments and checking markers and whatnot. I'm not the type to get spooked by the wind or anything, in other words. Well, in late June, I took 2 friends out to a spot that I'd used during the lockdowns. I'd hauled an old, rusted-out metal wheelbarrow into a clearing back then, repurposed it into a fire pit, and lined it with some river stones. It was really my North Star for that patch of woods, too. Except, when we got out there, the landscape refused to cooperate. We walked for 2 hours, and the clearing, the wheelbarrow, and the distinct Y-shaped oak that marked the trail were all gone. It was like the forest had been sort of rearranged almost. Frustrated, we just pitched our gear into a random hollow and we got a fire going in the end. Around 11 p.m., one of the lads, Mark, decided the dark was getting to him and he wanted to head back to the streetlights. I volunteered to walk him to the perimeter. The walk out was pretty uneventful, really, but on the return trip, about 300 yards from our fire, I swear to you that I heard a voice. It was a man's voice, monotone and flat, calling my name from the dense brush to my left. It sounded like a recording of myself, though, sort of sounding like it was playing through a cheap speaker. I didn't stop. I just kept my eyes fixed on that distant glow of our campfire and moved quicker. When I got back to the clearing, the other guy, Dave, was standing by the fire, his shoulders hunched up to his ears. He looked at me and said, "Did you hear that, man?" He hadn't been calling for me. He'd been listening to something else. A sound like a heavy steel pipe slamming into the trunk of a tree over and over again, coming from the blackness behind us. It wasn't wood hitting wood. That much was absolutely clear. It was the unmistakable sharp ringing clang of like iron or something. We didn't debate it any further, though. We threw our gear into our packs and started bushwhacking back toward town. We hadn't gone 20 minutes in, too, when I stopped dead. Sitting in the middle of the trail that we'd already walked over earlier that evening, and I want to stress that we had been here multiple times, was the wheelbarrow. It was rusted, filled with fresh wood ash, and sitting exactly where I'd remembered it being months ago. Beside it lay a single thick leather work glove as well, the kind that Dave had been wearing until we started packing up. I looked at Dave, who was staring at the glove with his mouth hanging open. I haven't taken mine off since we left the fire," he whispered. Just then, too, the clanging started again, a massive metallic thud that literally echoed through the trees, like something had been hurled at us from 50 feet away almost. Then another one, closer. And then it sounded like someone was dragging a sheet of corrugated metal through the underbrush at a sprint. As you can probably imagine, we didn't look back. We just sprinted through the dark, tearing our clothes on the brambles, and scrambled over a 6-foot chain link fence into a farmer's field, collapsing onto the grass just to get away from the tree line. We eventually made our way through the field and back onto a street, and we went home after that. We called Mark the next morning. He was already at his place, confirmed that he'd stayed home, and asked if we found his glove at the site. I told him that we had found one, sitting in a place that didn't make much sense, but I've thought about going back in daylight, but the memory of that sound and that flat mechanical sort of rhythmic ringing in the trees, it prevents me from doing so and always stays with me. I don't know who or what was moving that wheelbarrow around or how it had Dave's gear before we even dropped it. All I know is that those woods felt like a machine that had been turned on while we were still inside of it. And so I have not stepped foot into it since then. Back in 2017, I was 19 and living in a concrete-heavy, brutalist apartment complex on the outskirts of Munich. It was a bleak time in my life, really. Lots of cheap synthetic drugs, aimless nights, and people who were just sort of hollowed out as much as I was. I met Elle at a basement party in a suburb near Parsing. She was really an outlier, too. The room was a chaos of loud music and frantic energy, but she just sort of sat there in the corner chair, perfectly still, watching the rest of us like she was taking notes. We didn't talk much, but the way that she held her gaze, that always stuck with me. 5 years later, in 2022, I was at an illegal warehouse rave. It was a sensory overload too. Strobe lights, heavy bass, people sweating through their shirts. And out of nowhere, she just sort of appeared in the crowd. And the weird thing is that she looked exactly the same, as if she hadn't even aged a day. We spent the night together in that manic, chemically fueled bubble. She was intense too, clinging to me with a kind of desperate focus that felt more like she was trying to read my thoughts than actually have a conversation. When I finally left the club, I accidentally kept her sweater though. It was a petty, stupid excuse to reach out again, but I sent her a message and she came over 2 nights later. Now, the moment that she stepped into my apartment, The air suddenly just changed. It felt thin. She didn't walk like a person, too. She moved with a sort of fluid, predatory grace that made the room feel smaller. She sat on my couch and, without any preamble, started talking about a friend who had cheated her. She described locking the door to her flat, sitting the person down and carving into their back with a box cutter. She didn't sound angry. She sounded bored when she said it, like she was describing a tedious chore. I sat there, my hands locked down between my knees, trying to keep my breathing even. I didn't want to challenge her. At this point, I honestly just wanted her to leave. We went through the motions of sleeping together, though, but it felt like I was sharing a bed with a mannequin almost. Cold, unresponsive, and deeply fundamentally wrong. But when she finally walked out at 4 a.m, the silence in the apartment felt like a literal physical weight had lifted. I went dark on her after that. I blocked her number and changed my routines entirely. 2 months later, though, I was struggling with a heavy bout of insomnia at one point. It was maybe around 11:30 on a Tuesday, and I was walking to the 24-hour kiosk to get some cigarettes, and my phone buzzed in my pocket. There was a Snapchat notification. I opened it, and a high-contrast photo of my front door, taken from the hallway, was there. I was confused at first. I didn't even realize it was my door at first, to be honest, but when I did, my stomach turned. I didn't open it. I waited a heartbeat, in fact, and another notification popped up. A photo of my welcome mat, taken from inside of the stairwell. Then a third, the view of my apartment window from the service alleyway outside. No text, no emojis, just the documentation of my perimeter, it seemed. I didn't go back to the apartment after that. I went to a friend's place instead, stayed on his floor for 3 days, and then moved my stuff out while he stood guard in the hall. It was another 2 years as well before I saw her again. I was at a crowded pub, minding my own business, when I felt pressure on my shoulder. She was standing right behind me. Her face was a mask of cold and sharp fury. She didn't ask how I was. She just leaned in, her breath warm and moist, and whispered, "Why are you telling people that I'm sick?" Again, the air around us suddenly changed, and it seemed like it was humming. That same low artificial frequency that I had felt years ago. I didn't look at her. I didn't even finish my drink, in fact. I just walked out the back door, and I didn't stop until I was 3 blocks away, checking over my shoulder every 10 feet. I moved to a different city a month later after that. And look, people call it a toxic encounter or a stalker situation, but I just really don't think that captures it entirely. It honestly felt like I was being hunted by, well, someone who wasn't playing by the rules of, human social interaction at all. I have seen her since then, but thankfully she hasn't seen me, and my first instinct is to always sort of want to say hello, but then I get that same gut feeling, and I always back out. I was driving back home from a job site some years back in winter. I'm 41, and by the time that I hit one of those isolated 24-hour gas stations out in the middle of nowhere, I was pretty much running on nothing but caffeine and exhaustion. It was about 2 a.m., the kind of cold that sinks into your marrow, and the forecourt was dead silent, well, except for the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. I was walking out of the shop with a pie and a bottle of water when a guy appeared from the shadows near the entrance. I held the door for him, a reflex, and he caught it. He didn't just walk past, he sort of swerved into my personal space, his shoulder brushing mine. "You shouldn't be eating that," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. "That's all chemicals, you know. It'll kill you." I kept walking toward my truck, ignoring him. I figured that he was just some local burnout looking for a conversation or something. But he kept pace with me, his stride syncing up with mine. He reached out and planted a hand on my upper back. Not a shove, but just a firm, heavy grip, the kind that you'd use to steer a child. "Come over to the van," he said, nodding toward an older, faded white panel van tucked into the dark corner of the lot, away from the security cameras. "I've got some real food, proper stuff." I stepped hard to the side, breaking his hold. "No, I'm good," I said, my voice steady but sharp. He didn't flinch. He just tilted his head, his eyes tracking me with a terrifying level of focus. "You got a wife waiting at home? Someone to cook for you?" "I'm married," I lied, stepping faster. "I'm in a hurry." He laughed, a dry wheezing sound. He didn't move toward his van, but he didn't stop talking either. He started rattling off nonsense, questions about my route, my life, my background, trying to sort of almost map out who I was. Then he stopped and looked me dead in the eye. "Look at me. Be honest. How old do you think that I am?" I didn't want to engage any further, but I wanted to get into the car without a confrontation as well, so I said, "Mid-40s, my hand already digging for my keys in my pocket. His entire demeanor curdled, his jaw tightened, and the polite mask, it slipped off. "I'm 30, he snapped, his voice dropping an octave. "People always think that I'm older than that. You're just like the rest of them." He took a step toward me, his hand balling into a fist. I didn't wait for the next sentence. I hit the unlock button, threw myself into the truck, and slammed the door, locking it before my backside even hit the seat. He stayed there for a moment too, standing under the light of the gas pumps, watching me start the engine. As I pulled out onto the highway, I checked my mirrors constantly. He didn't head for the van. He just stood there, motionless, a dark silhouette against the gravel, watching the truck until I rounded the bend. Now, it certainly wasn't a long interaction, maybe 90 seconds total, but the whole thing seemed surgical. He was testing my boundaries, trying to see if I'd let him lure me into the dark, and then he was trying to provoke a reaction when I didn't play along. I didn't sleep that whole drive back, in fact. Every set of headlights that came up behind me in the darkness, it just made my skin crawl. I was 25 last November, heading home after a big day of surfing. I'd also spent the evening at a bar with some friends, and like I'd done dozens of times before, I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare. It was roughly 2 a.m. and the streets were mostly empty, and I was pretty exhausted after a really big day. The driver picked me up a few minutes later, a man who didn't say a word when I climbed into the back seat. I buckled up, pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, and I sort of started to zone out. We were about 10 minutes into the trip, heading down a stretch of road that bordered a decommissioned industrial park, when the car suddenly slowed down. He didn't pull into a driveway, he just sort of veered toward the shoulder and came to a stop. The engine kept ticking over, but there was really no reason to stop here. Hey, I said, leaning forward. Why are we stopping here, man? Is everything okay?" He didn't turn around. He just sort of shrugged, a slow, stiff movement of his shoulders, and mumbled something in a language that I didn't know. His tone was jagged, not confused, but calculated, like he was almost waiting for something to happen. He reached toward the center console, picked up a plastic water bottle, and began to shake it, the plastic crinkling sharply in the silence of the car. He kept murmuring, "Water, water," over and over again. My gut sort of dropped. This wasn't just a mismatch in conversation. It seemed more like a performance. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Unlock the doors," I said, my voice rising now. He stopped shaking the bottle. He didn't look back. He just kept staring out of the windshield at the darkened warehouse. And this is when I panicked. and fumbled for the manual override. It felt like I was moving through thick water, the seconds stretching into minutes while my fingers clawed at the trim. The moment that the lock clicked, I didn't wait. I shoved the door open and threw myself out onto the bitumen. I didn't look back too, I just ran. I hit the emergency call on my phone with shaking hands as my boots scrambled for traction on the pavement. I heard his driver's side door creak open behind me. I risked a single glance over my shoulder and I saw him step out of the car at one point. He took 3 long, deliberate strides in my direction and then stopped dead. He stood there for a beat, a silhouette against the industrial gloom, watching me sprint away. Then, just as abruptly, he turned, got back into the vehicle, and pulled away into the dark. I stayed on the line with dispatch, sprinting toward the glow of a distant gas station until I found a well-lit corner near a busy intersection. I didn't stop moving until I was surrounded by the noise of traffic and the security lights of a shopfront. I reported the incident, but there was little that they could do. I've spent months trying to rationalize it. I mean, maybe he was having a medical episode, maybe he was exhausted, but that doesn't explain the door locks or the way that he waited for me to exit before stepping out himself. Honestly, it felt like a trap that just didn't snap shut simply because I refused to stay inside. I still use rideshares from time to time, but I don't look out the window anymore at all. I intently watch the map, I check the locks the second that I sit down, and I listen to that low primal alarm in my gut that warned me long before the car even stopped. Some things don't need a logical explanation to be dangerous. Instead, they just need an opportunity. So I flew out to visit my girlfriend last year in a secondary city in southern India. I was still adjusting to the place, really, constantly relying on her for navigation and local context. We'd been out for a late dinner, leaving a bustling roadside spot around 11:30. It was pretty humid out, but the street still had that sort of lingering late-night energy that made the city feel pretty safe. I had rented a scooter for the week, which gave us a bit of independence, and as we pulled out onto the street, I spotted 2 men sitting on a motorbike near the corner. Their engine was idling, and they were perfectly motionless, just watching the traffic. It was a pretty common sight, really, but for some reason my gut gave a sharp, unbidden warning. I didn't say anything to my girlfriend, just sort of focused on the road at first. A few minutes into the drive, I checked my side mirror, and the same bike was behind us. I told myself, though, that it was just shared traffic. But when I slowed down near a brightly lit shop under the guise of checking my phone, they slowed down too, staying back in the shadows, keeping a deliberate fixed distance. When I pulled into the flow of traffic, they did the same too. That was when the static hit my brain. I leaned back and whispered, "Do you see that bike behind us?" My girlfriend's posture stiffened instantly. "Yes," she breathed. "They've been there since we left." It was around this time, too, that the city really began to thin out. We hit stretches of road where the shops gave way to dark, looming walls and stretches of unlit pavement. I realized then that I couldn't risk leading them to her apartment, so I asked her for the nearest police station, my heart now racing 1,000 miles an hour. We started testing them, too. I took a hard right, then a jagged left, cutting through narrow residential lanes. They mirrored every single move, always keeping the same predatory gap, never closing in and never falling away. This was a controlled hunt. Suddenly, they throttled up, though. The engine whined as they tore past us, pulling up sharply about 30 meters ahead. They stopped their bike sideways, effectively barring the lane. This was a blockade, plain and simple. Seeing that, my adrenaline instantly spiked, that cold, crystalline clarity where everything slows down. I didn't stop, though. I slowed just enough to lull them into thinking that I was about to yield, and then I yanked the handlebars, swerving into a tight gravel-strewn side alley that felt like a suicide mission at first. My girlfriend shouted directions, her voice tight with terror, guiding me toward the precinct that she'd been tracking on her phone. We skidded into the precinct driveway, the scooter's tires kicking up dust as I slammed it to a halt right in front of two officers standing by the entrance. The two men on the motorbike, they didn't even slow down. As they roared past the station, one of them turned his head, shouting something guttural and sharp into the night, but they didn't dare stop. They vanished into the dark as quickly as they had appeared. My girlfriend, she spoke rapidly to the officers in their local language, her hands shaking as she gestured toward the street. They didn't brush us off too, thankfully. One officer mounted his bike and tore off in the direction that the men had fled, while the other waited with us until he returned. They also ended up escorting us the rest of the way to her flat. Now, obviously nothing happened in the sense of like physical confrontation, but the intent, it was clear as a physical blow. The way that they had mirrored our movements, tested our reactions, and coordinated that blockade, it was a practice lethal efficiency. I didn't sleep at all that night too, or the next really. Every time that I closed my eyes, I could see that bike idling in the shadows, waiting for us to just make one wrong turn. I've traveled all over the world, but that night, it changed the way that I moved through the world forever. I don't just look for where I'm going anymore. I now look for who is watching me go there. I was 20 years old at the time, and I was working the swing shift at a 24-hour print shop in downtown Portland. The main thing that I did was actually loading heavy pallets, but I picked up a bit of a side hustle cleaning out high-end retail offices after the staff left for the night. It was late September of last year. I'd usually finish up at around 3 in the morning, throw my gear into the trunk of my beat-up sedan, and I would drive home. The office building had a private loading dock tucked behind a chain-linked fence, but it was sort of off of a bit of a dead-end alleyway. It was always quiet there, but that night, the silence felt particularly heavy. So, I just locked the gate and was walking toward my car when I noticed a bicycle leaned against the brick wall near my driver's side door. It wasn't there when I arrived, and it was an old road bike, rusted chain, no lights. Honestly, I didn't know what to make of it at first. Maybe a courier had left it, or maybe somebody was messing around. I put my key into the door, but before I could turn it, I saw movement in the reflection of my window. A guy was pressed flat against the wall of the dumpster enclosure about 10 feet away. He wasn't doing anything, but just sort of standing there, one hand on the rim of the bin. He was wearing an oversized tan raincoat, which looked completely out of place in the humidity. He wasn't looking at me, but he wasn't looking away either. His head was sort of tilted, staring at the ground, as if he were sort of trying to listen to something under the asphalt. I didn't unlock the door. I just sort of stepped back, my hand gripping my keys hard enough to bite into my palm a bit. I stayed like that too, for maybe 10 seconds, watching him. He didn't blink. He didn't even shift his weight. I decided to gamble at that point. I would walk fast toward the main street where the neon signs for the nearby bodega were still buzzing. I heard the scuff of rubber on the pavement behind me all of a sudden when I did that, though. I glanced back. He was walking, not running, but his strides were enormous. He was covering ground way faster than a normal person should be. He didn't look like he was chasing me, though. He sort of looked like he was pacing me. Every time that I sped up, the sound of his shoes on the concrete stayed exactly 10 feet behind. I hit the sidewalk, the bright light from the bodega washing over the street. I turned around ready to yell, to ask him what the hell he wanted. But when I did, the alleyway entrance was empty. I didn't go back for my car that night. I walked 3 miles home, my lungs burning in the damp air, checking over my shoulder every block. The next morning, I had my brother drive me back to pick up the sedan. The bike was now gone. My car was exactly where I'd left it, but the driver's side handle was smeared with something grey and chalky, almost like industrial-grade drywall dust. I wiped it off with my sleeve and I got the heck out of there. I quit the cleaning job that same day after that. I didn't really need it in the end as well, so it just didn't make sense anymore to keep doing it. It's been months since this happened, and I still cannot shake the way that he looked. That weird tilt of the head, and the way that he moved without a shred of urgency, as if he knew exactly where I was going and didn't feel the need to rush. Strangely too, I don't think that it was a mugging attempt or anything. It felt like he was almost just verifying something, like he'd been waiting for me to walk out of that door all night, and once I did, apparently his business was finished. So I was helping my cousin clear out some brush on a piece of scrubland that he'd just bought, out past the Hawkesbury River, north of Sydney. This was back in mid-July. The lot, it was a total disaster too, choked with lantana and overgrown wattle, bordering a dry creek bed that acted like a natural funnel for the wind. It was the kind of place where you could walk 10 feet into the bush and you would lose sight of the road entirely. We had been hacking away at it for like 3 days at this point, living out of a canvas tent that he'd pitched near the old logging track. The nearest town, that was a good 20-minute drive away, and at night, the silence out there was really heavy. It was our second night. The sun had dipped below the ridge at around 5:30, and the temperature had plummeted. We were sitting by a small fire, eating some very nutritious dehydrated meals, when I saw the first blink of light. It was way out in the timber, maybe 50 meters up the slope. I assumed at first that it was a spotlight from a hunter's rig, but there was no engine drone, no dust, no metallic clinking of gear or anything like that. Just a really weird dull yellow-white beam that cut through the haze. It didn't bounce as well, which was a bit strange. It moved with a smooth gliding motion, tracing the edge of the creek bed. Then it stopped, aimed directly at our campsite, and just sort of stayed there. It held for a full minute, motionless. My cousin stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and yelled, "Hey, you looking for someone?" Nothing. No voice came back, and there was no movement. The light just sort of blinked out, leaving the forest floor looking darker than it had before. I just started to settle back down when my cousin's dog, a massive, usually fearless bull Arab, let out a low, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the plates in his chest. He wasn't looking at the creek, though. He was looking at the thicket of trees right behind our tent. I flicked my heavy-duty work torch on, the LED beam carving a path through the dark. I swung it over the tent, over the brush, and then right toward the dog's line of sight. And right there, just standing there, was a man. He was standing about 10 feet from the tent, partially obscured by a tree trunk, but his legs were clearly visible. He was wearing heavy, dark work boots that looked caked in dry mud. He wasn't leaning. He was standing perfectly rigid, arms at his sides. He had a flashlight in his hand, but it was pointed down at the dirt and not at us. I didn't think, though. I just sort of barked, "Who the hell are you?" He didn't move. He didn't even turn his head. He just stood there, his back sort of half turned to the light as if he were waiting for me to do something. The dog surged forward, though, snapping his teeth, and the man didn't even flinch. He just stepped backward, not a scramble and not a run. He just smoothly retreated into the dense wall of wattle, his boots making zero noise on the dry leaves. I chased him for maybe 15 steps, my light sweeping the brush, but when I got there was nothing. No snapping branches, no rustle of fabric, no indentations in the scrub that I could find. It was dark, though, admittedly, but it was almost as if he just turned into smoke. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in the ute with the engine running until the sky started to grey out at about 6 in the morning. But when we walked back to the tent, again, we couldn't find any boot prints in the dust where he had been standing. There wasn't even a single scuff mark that we could find. I don't know who he was and what he was doing out there, or why he was hovering in the dark without a sound like that, but I know what I saw. I've spent a lot of my life working outdoors, and people, they leave traces. They break twigs, they scuff the earth, they breathe at the very least. But he didn't seem to do any of that. I know that this is going to sound a bit weird as well, but it felt more like he was a projection rather than a real person. And that's something that's still hard for me to explain. Whatever the case, we packed up the next morning and we left pretty quickly. I didn't come back to help after that too. I didn't care how cheap the land was. It just was not worth going back. I'm a mechanic, and so I don't really believe in things that I can't put a wrench on or fix with a diagnostic tool. When I bought this old Victorian-style terrace house in a quiet suburb early last year, it was just because it was cheap, structurally sound, and had a massive shed out back. I'm a rational person too, and so if something breaks, I tend to just try and fix it. If the house makes noise, well, that's just the house settling too. The first few weeks there were fine too, but then I started getting this feeling. Like I'd walk into the living room and the temperature would drop like 5 degrees in a second. I figured that it was just bad insulation in the floorboards. I'd been working on a project in the kitchen, and so I grabbed my coffee and I put it on the counter. I would then turn around to grab a tool or whatever, turn back, and the mug would be sitting 3 feet away, right at the edge of the granite. Every time I was obviously pretty weirded out by that, but I blamed it on my own distraction and nothing else. Then there was the radio in the garage. So I have this old transistor radio that I use for background noise while I'm stripping engines. It's got a physical dial, no Bluetooth and no smart tech, and I would turn it off, walk inside, have dinner, and come back out to it to find it playing at full volume. It wasn't even tuned to a station though, just static that sounded like somebody was screaming under a mountain of blankets. I would always unplug it, but the next night, the same thing. I started keeping the lights on after that. I'm a little bit ashamed admitting that, but it wasn't because I was scared, but because it was just starting to get on my nerves for the most part. It all came to a head on a Tuesday night though, in late November. So I was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through my phone, dead silent. The house was locked tight. The storm outside had passed hours ago, so the air was still and warm. When suddenly I felt a sharp, stinging pressure on my shoulder, like somebody had just poked me with a finger. I spun around expecting my dog, or maybe the neighbor's cat that had somehow squeezed inside, but there was nothing. But then, and I swear to you that this is exactly what happened, right against my ear, a voice said, "Move." Now, this was not a whisper. It was loud, dry, and sounded like somebody gurgling gravel almost. It was a command, spoken with such authority that I instinctively jerked forward, hitting myself against the coffee table. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, not breathing, staring at the empty air behind me. My skin felt tight, like I was wearing a suit 2 sizes too small. I got up, grabbed a heavy flashlight from the junk drawer, and walked every inch of that house looking for someone. I checked the attic, the cellar, the crawl space under the floorboards, but there was nothing. No one. I stopped trying to rationalize it after that. I know that it wasn't airflow, it wasn't wiring. Wiring doesn't have a voice, and a draft doesn't tell you to get out of the way. I haven't moved out yet. I'm too stubborn for that, really, but I've started leaving the shed lights on, and I make sure that the deadbolt is turned twice before I go to sleep every night. I'm still working on my projects, but I don't keep the house dead silent anymore. I keep a fan running instead, as loud as it'll go, just to drown out the sound of the house or whatever is happening. Shifting furniture around is the new thing, when I'm not looking, of course. I don't know if this is a person or an energy or something that I just cannot understand or make sense of, or a breakdown of my own mind or something. But I do know this. If that voice ever says something again, I'm not going to bother checking the attic this time. I think next time, I'm just going to walk out the front door and I won't be coming back. So I grew up in a tightly packed cul-de-sac in the suburbs. You know the type. Brick veneer, uniform driveways, and back fences that are thin enough to hear your neighbors sneezing. It was 2012. I was 15 and I spent most of my time hanging around the park at the end of our street. There was a kid in our year who lived 3 houses down. He was quiet, the kind of person who seemed to fade into the background until he wasn't there at all. And one morning, the street was filled with unmarked cars and people in suits. We found out later that he'd actually ended himself in his bedroom. The mood of the cul-de-sac, it shifted overnight immediately after that too. For about a week, it was honestly just really sad. But then, the weirdness started. Now, it wasn't a haunting in the classic sense. It was just movement, really. My dad, who was a shift worker, started complaining about somebody pacing on our roof at 3 in the morning. He even climbed up there with a flashlight a few times, convinced that somebody was up there. A local thief is what he would say. But he never found anything. But the sound, the sort of heavy scruff sound on the roof, the rubber soles against the terracotta tiles, really, it would happen while he was standing directly underneath it in the kitchen. Which I think is why he was so convinced in the end. One night, though, I woke up because my dog was whining at the bedroom window. I pulled the curtain back. The street was bathed in some light, and across the road, sitting on the edge of the neighbor's secondary story balcony railing, was a figure. It was hunched over, knees pulled up to its chest. It looked a bit like a gargoyle cast in the shadow. I stood there, my forehead pressed almost against the glass, trying to reconcile the silhouette with a human shape. When I reached for the latch to slide the window open, the figure just sort of folded, is the best way that I can put it. It didn't jump, it didn't climb down, it just sort of folded in on itself, into the dark, and then just sort of, well, it was gone. The banging started at the house between ours and this kid's shortly afterward too. The people there were an older couple, and they swore that somebody was pounding on their interior hallway walls at night. They even had a builder come out to check the foundations, thinking that maybe the house was moving drastically or something, but he never found anything. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the cul-de-sac just went quiet again. There were no footsteps anymore, no shapes on railings, no banging on roofs or anything. The house that the kid lived in stayed empty for 3 years, too. Eventually, though, a young couple with a 4-year-old girl moved in. They were friendly, too, the kind of people who put up fairy lights for Christmas and kept the lawn pretty much pristine all the time. The little girl who lived there was always bright and loud. But about 6 months in, she stopped playing outside, and I didn't see her for a long time. I would see her sort of sitting in her bedroom window sometimes, just staring out at the park, not moving for hours. Her parents told my mum at a block party that she had started having night terrors apparently, screaming that the boy was standing in the corner of her room, asking for his belt back. They moved out 6 months after that. The house was sold to a rental company, and it's been a revolving door of tenants ever since then. None of them staying longer than a year. I'm 29 now, and I've moved to the city, but I still drive past that cul-de-sac sometimes when I'm visiting my parents. That house, it always looks different from the others. The paint is just a little bit duller, the weeds in the front garden a little bit taller, and look, I don't believe in ghosts really, and I don't believe in curses or anything like that, but I do believe that some places hold on to events until they leave a stain. Whatever happened in that room, it doesn't seem like it was just a tragedy. It was something that didn't know how to stop being present, and it's never left that place since then. So I was about 8 years old, living in one of those old weatherboard rental houses. My parents were going through a hellish divorce at the time, and the house felt like a pressure cooker. My mum spent most of her time in the bedroom, chain-smoking and staring at the wall, so I learned to exist in the margins, spending my afternoons catching lizards in the tall grass behind the fence. It was mid-July, one of those crisp, dry mornings that makes the fields look like they're burning gold under the sun. My mum had been expecting her younger brother to drop by at some point. She'd been jittery all morning, pacing the kitchen floor and checking her watch every 10 minutes. Around 7 a.m., I would say, I heard the screen door rattle. I figured that it was my uncle, but when I walked into the kitchen, the room was empty. I walked out the back door into the landing, and there was a boy sitting on the bottom step, hunched over the dirt. He was wearing a faded navy blue polo shirt and jeans. He looked about my age, maybe a little bit taller, and he had hair that looked like it had been cut with kitchen scissors almost, a little bit choppy, not professional. I genuinely wasn't scared too. I just walked down and sat next to him. He was playing with a jagged piece of quartz or something, digging into the soft earth between the boards of the stairs. He sort of looked at me, but he shifted over a few inches to make some room. I started rambling about school, about how loud my parents had been fighting the night before. He didn't say a word though, just kept scratching that rock into the dirt. I remember the way that he moved though. Every gesture was sort of really slow and deliberate, like he was underwater almost. He eventually turned to look at me, and his eyes were so light that they almost looked clear, like water in glass, a tiny bit of blue if anything. He pressed the rock into my palm and closed my fingers over it, and it felt like I was holding an ice cube, even in the morning heat. I then stood up to get some juice, thinking that maybe a drink would get him to open up a bit and talk to me. I took 2 steps toward the back door, felt a weird prickle on the back of my neck, and turned around to tell him to come inside and get a drink, but when I did, he was gone. The landing was empty, the grass behind the steps was still, not even a sway to indicate that he had stood up to run or anything. I walked to the edge of the yard, looked over the fence and scanned the entire road. I looked everywhere, but he was nowhere to be seen anymore. I then went back to where he was sitting, and I saw the jagged groove that he'd left in the soil with that rock. I went inside and found my mum in the kitchen. She wasn't alone. She was talking to my uncle. I then told them, "The boy on the steps is waiting for a drink, you know." My mum looked at my uncle, then back at me, her face pale and drawn. "What boy, sweetheart?" I went back to the door to point him out, but there was nothing but the stairs. My mum walked out behind me, scanned the yard, and then let out this long, shuddering sigh. She didn't yell. She just sort of hugged me, and her arms were shaking so hard that I could hear her bangles clinking against my shoulder. I never mentioned it again after that. My parents sold the house a few months later, and we moved into a unit in town. I still have that piece of quartz, actually. It's sitting on my desk right next to me, right now in fact, right on top of some mail here. I've tried to figure out if it was a neighbor's kid playing a prank or a dream that I'd sort of had while half asleep or something, but I don't know, the math never really works out. Dreams, for instance, they don't leave a jagged groove in the dirt, and neighbors' kids don't just vanish from a fenced yard without making a bit of sound at least. I don't know. It feels less like a memory and like a moment that shouldn't have happened, but just still happened anyway. I was about 12 years old when my parents dragged us out into a rental in a semi-rural location. This was back in 2014, and the place was a brutalist-style construction. Nothing but exposed concrete, floor-to-ceiling glass, and a spiral staircase that felt like a death trap in the dark. We moved in, though, around midwinter, and the house was always freezing, the kind of damp cold that seemed to seep out of the walls themselves. My dad, a pragmatic man who spent his life dealing with commercial plumbing, hated that house from the second that we signed the lease. He complained about the pressure, a specific heavy tightness in the air that gave him blinding migraines whenever he stepped into the hallway. It wasn't one massive event, too, that ruined that place. It was the slow, steady decay of reality, really. It all started with the kitchen island. It was a solid block of reclaimed mahogany. I'd been eating cereal, looked down to check my phone, and when I looked up, my bowl would be sort of rotated 90 degrees, or my spoon would be perched perfectly upright on its handle. My mum, at some point, actually stopped cleaning the island because she said that it felt like it was interrupting somebody's private space all the time. That was always really weird to me how she said that. Then came the sounds. My bedroom was on the ground floor, directly under the master. Around 2 in the morning, I'd hear the floorboards above me groan. Not a house-settling creak too, but that distinct heavy thud of a man pacing the perimeter of my room. My dad even would wake up sometimes, red-faced and ready to fight, but there was never anyone in the room. I confirmed this later in life with him, and he always said that it really frightened him. The most jarring incident, though, that involved my younger brother. He was 6 at the time, and one afternoon he came out of the laundry room screaming and clutching his forearm. When we got him to calm down, there was a perfect bruise of a hand on his skin. Not a child's hand, too. It was way too broad, the fingers spanning almost his entire forearm. Now, I know that he didn't just make that up, because he would never go back into that room for the remaining 2 years that we lived there. It absolutely terrified him. My mother was the one who saw the figure, though. Now, she was working late in the home office one night, a glass wall annexed off of the main living area. She told me that she looked up from her laptop at one point, and she says that she saw a man standing on the patio, pressed right against the glass. She described him as looking like he had just been hauled out of a dam, skin the color of wet parchment, clothes dark with like sludge or something, water dripping off his coat and pooling on the exterior concrete. She immediately yelled for my dad, but by the time that he rounded the corner with a golf club, the patio was empty. He obviously checked the perimeter, and the gate was still padlocked from the inside, the doors all locked. We didn't understand how this guy even got in at the time. That night, my dad, though, he finally sort of snapped. We were all in the lounge when the television, which had been turned off for hours, suddenly flickered to life. It didn't have a signal, it was just static, but in the center of the white noise, a grainy, flickering image appeared. It almost seemed to be a top-down view of our living room. We were all sitting there, though, staring at the screen, absolutely fixated on this thing. I remember the camera, or whatever it was, sort of zoomed in, but it was more like somebody was sort of physically walking forward. I know that sounds really weird, but that's really the only way to describe it, until it was literally just inches from my father's face. He ripped the power cord from the wall, but the TV kept playing for another few seconds, the image of us sitting there frozen on the glass in static. My dad, he completely lost it after that, started yelling at whatever this thing was, and we moved out 3 months later, breaking the lease and losing the deposit. I don't know who lives there now, but whoever they are, I sure hope they're okay. I've seen the for lease sign go up a few times down the years, and sometimes driving back from the city I'll see that place. I take the long way home just to see if the lights are still on there, and they usually aren't, but sometimes people have moved in. Again, I don't know what was in that place, but I am certain that we were not alone and that there was something there. I was stationed at a remote signal relay base in the mountains of the Northern Balkans back in 2013. It was a decommissioned Soviet-era facility, half-carved into the side of a limestone ridge. My job was mind-numbing, let me tell you, monitoring a bank of static-heavy shortwave radios and logging equipment maintenance schedules. There were only 4 of us assigned to the site. We lived in the upper bunker, while the lower levels, which supposedly housed the actual relay hardware, were mostly sealed off. The facility had a layout that made no sense. Corridors ended in blank concrete walls, and there were rooms that didn't appear on any of the blueprints that we were issued. By the second month, the isolation, it had already started to fray our nerves a bit. We were constantly tired, prone to snapping at each other, and the humidity underground was so thick that it felt like you were breathing through a wet rag at times. Around late October, we started hearing the vibration. It would begin at 2 in the morning. It sounded like a heavy electric generator almost, struggling to turn over. I spent 3 nights roaming the lower levels with a heavy-duty flashlight, convinced that a circuit had blown in the sub-basement. Every time that I hit the main relay room, the hum would stop instantly. One night, my lead tech, a guy named Vlado, came up from the lower levels looking like he had seen a car crash. He didn't say a word, just poured himself a double shot of black coffee and stared at the wall. When I asked him what was going on, he muttered that he had heard someone tapping on the other side of the reinforced steel bulkhead inside of the sub-basement. "It's not a pipe," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The next night, I was on shift alone. The hum, it started up again, but this time, it was accompanied by, like, a weird scraping sound. I thought that it sounded a bit like a heavy canvas bag being dragged across coarse concrete. It was coming from the ventilation shaft above my desk. I grabbed a ladder and my flashlight, climbed up to the grate and shone the light inside. The shaft was clear for about 10 feet, and then it turned a sharp corner that I couldn't see past. As I braced myself to get a better look, that was when I saw fingers. Now, they were not human. They were far too long, with extra knuckles, and the skin, it was translucent and sickly grey. They were curled around the edge of the metal shaft, pulling slowly. I didn't yell, I didn't drop the light, I just froze, staring at those digits as they gripped the edge of the grate from the inside of that shaft. I scrambled down the ladder just as the grate propped out of its frame with a sickening screech of rusted screws. I didn't look back. I bolted for the security door, slamming the heavy iron bolt home. The sound that followed was something more than a growl. It was like a roar. I called Vlado on the radio. He didn't even sound surprised. He told me to get to the sleeping quarters and lock the inner pressure door. When he reached me 10 minutes later, he wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying a ledger. He flipped it open to a section marked Maintenance Log, which was dated from the 80s. "Read the last entry," he said. I looked down. It was a single line of text written in ink that faded to a rusty brown. "The relay housing has something in it." We finished rotation, but we didn't go back into the lower levels. We sat in the relay room with every light burning, staring at the steel door. The sounds didn't stop until the sun hit the ridge the next morning. I don't know what was in that shaft, and I don't know what was behind that bulkhead. But every time that I think about it, my skin starts to crawl. I spent a long time trying to convince myself that I was just hallucinating or seeing things from the tiredness and all that. But I no longer believe that. I know what I saw, and it wasn't human. So some years back, I was living in a farmhouse outside of rural Iowa. The property backed into a thick, unmanaged belt of timber that followed the contours of the Turkey River. It was a miserable, wet autumn, the kind of mud that holds onto your boots like glue. I was staying there to help my cousin sort out a probate issue for his father's estate, spending my days clearing overgrown fence lines and my nights nursing cheap beer by a wood-burning stove. The locals in town had this way of talking about the Turkey River Basin. They didn't use ghost stories or campfire tropes. They just called it the Dead Pocket. Whenever I brought up clearing the brush along the northern fence line, the hardware store guy just looked at me and said, "The fence is fine where it is, son. Let the vines have it." I was clearing an old wire mesh barrier about maybe half a mile from the house, right where the ground starts to lift toward the ridge. It was late afternoon, maybe 4:30, but the canopy was so choked with autumn scrub that it was already dim at twilight. And then, all of a sudden, it was like the world just went mute. Now, this was not a gradual fade. It was like someone had slapped a pair of soundproof headphones over my ears. No wind, no distant highway drone, no rustle of dry leaves, just my own breathing, loud and ragged in the void. I stood up, resting my back against a post, and the hair on my arm suddenly stood straight up. Not from the cold, but from the distinct electric sensation of being under a microscope almost. And then came the impact. It was heavy, a huge wet thump, the sound of something massive hitting the soft, saturated earth. Then another, then a third, accelerating, tearing through the brush toward me. It sounded like a quarter horse sprinting through knee-deep water. I didn't reach for my saw, I didn't reach for anything. I just scrambled backward, my heels catching on a root, and collapsed into a pile of rotting vine-covered timber. Strangely, though, nothing came out of that brush. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had begun, right at the edge of the clearing. I sat there in silence for what felt like about an hour, watching the shadows stretch. When I finally walked back to the house, my cousin on the porch was waiting there. He never did ask what I found. He just said to me, "You didn't go past the old white oak, did you?" I didn't listen to him. 2 nights later, I took a heavy-duty spotlight out there at around 10 p.m. I wanted to see if I could find a deer trail or maybe a coyote den that might explain that sound. I got to the same spot, where the air went dead, and I clicked on the light. The beam, it was pretty powerful for what it was, cutting a bright white tunnel through the black. I swept it along the fence line, looking for any disturbance in the mud. Then, I angled the light up into the canopy of a massive gnarled cottonwood, and about 20 feet up, clinging to the trunk, was something that made my stomach hit my knees. Now, it wasn't a bear, that much is very clear, and it also wasn't a person. It was the color of like bruised meat, with limbs that wrapped around the tree like a spider. It had no face, no eyes, no nose that I could make out, just a smooth, concave dip where the head really should have been. Honestly, too, it didn't look like an animal. It looked more like a tumor that had grown into the shape of something trying to be human. I didn't turn it off. I literally dropped the light, the beam spinning on the ground, creating frantic flickering shadows against the trees. I didn't run, but I moved as fast as I could without tripping. My heart was hammering and I was in a complete panic, and I didn't go back for the light. I packed up my truck that night instead, and I left the tools where they lay, and drove until I hit the interstate. I still think about that shape from time to time, how it was so perfectly still, seemingly waiting for me to shine the light on it so it could be seen. I don't believe in monsters, and I'm certainly not a spiritual person, but I now know that when the woods go silent like that, you don't stick around to ask why, because there's weird things out there. The best thing to do is just leave, and don't look back. On a quiet winter evening about a year ago, I witnessed something that I can only describe as out of this world. While out on a walk by the 14 Locks Canal Centre in South Wales, UK with my partner, we were walking down the main canal path going down the hill, and about 2/3 of the way down, the canal sort of locks, and we decided that we were going to go back because it was dark and pretty miserable. And I suggested to my partner to cut in through the woods because, why not, right? We drove there for a walk after all. But there's a small footbridge and a path which connects you to the main dirt path leading back into the car park from there. And when we were in the wooded area, my partner was complaining that she couldn't see because it was pitch black and was genuinely eerily dark. At this point, we were using the phone torches, and I suggested turning the phone lights off to see better because it was that dark that the phone lights just sort of made it worse. So we did, and it did help a little bit. And as we carried on walking towards the main dirt path going back to the car park, as we got onto the dirt path, I spotted something white in the corner of my eye that caught my attention, just by a tree on my 4 to 5 o'clock position, about 12 feet behind me. I turned to get a proper look, and when I looked at it, I was so shook by what I saw that I turned my head away almost instantaneously. Part of me didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew what I saw, and it freaked me out. About 10 steps later, I said to my partner, "Babe, did you see that?" Of which she replied, "Yes, let's get out of here." As she's saying that too, we glanced behind again, and this thing was right behind us now. At this point, we ran. We really got on them 10 toes, and we didn't stop until we reached the car park. It's funny how the way back to the car park is uphill, and a pretty respectable walk on a good day, but we sprinted up that hill like it was flat, out of adrenaline and pure fear, I guess. Now, I know what I saw was real, and I honestly shivered inside when she replied acknowledging that she saw it too. This thing, whatever it was bright white in color. I can only describe it as a skinny-ish figure, but the thing is that there wasn't any obvious legs, arms, or features. It was about 6 to 7 feet tall and had a glow to it, and it hovered about a foot off the ground as well. I can remember this day like it was yesterday. It was like a white smudge in the air, roughly the shape of like a round milk ice cream stick, but at the same time a little bit transparent. Now, I'd normally be skeptical of ghosts and all that, but if I ever needed solid concrete proof that ghosts or spirits or, dare I say, alien entities exist, then that was it in front of my face. The fact when I asked her, "Did you see that?" and she instantly said, "Yes, let's get out of here," verified that indeed this thing was there, and I wasn't just seeing things. To this day, even when she talks about this story, she describes the exact same thing I saw, pretty much word for word. I'm glad that she was there because she saw it too, because if it was just me, I'd probably be questioning myself right now, thinking that maybe I didn't see that, but no, we both definitely saw it. I've gone back to 14 Locks since then, just to confirm that there's no signs or posts which could have reflected light or something, moonlight or general light pollution, and basically tried to debunk what I saw in any way possible. But the thing is that there's just nothing there that was the same height or even capable of reflecting light, so this thing was there for sure. Was this a ghost sighting though? Why did it just randomly show up, as I've been through there many times over many years and never seen anything like that before? It clearly knew that we were there and it was interested in us, considering that the second time I glanced at it, it seemed to have moved closer to us, much too close for comfort in fact. I've heard similar stories elsewhere and no one believed them either in their stories. But it's crazy to think that there's stuff out there like this. I'm not exactly sure how to start this off, but this is going to be a collection of paranormal experiences that I've had through the 31 years of my life, from early years like 1993 up to about February of 2024. Some of the timelines might be a bit fuzzy, but the events are true. I'll start with childhood and lead up to the present day. So I grew up in a house with both parents and a sister in a fairly new single-story house with absolutely no paranormal history. My sister is just shy of 2 years younger than me. At birth, my sister and I had been baptized and grown up in a Catholic family. Our parents weren't very churchy people, I guess, but our grandparents were the old-school heavy Catholic type. My parents would recall stories to us when we were very little, such as my room was the coldest in the house no matter what. This could be caused from how the ventilation was built for the house, so that wasn't anything too wild. Other things they said were hearing loud bangs on the other side of the house when they're home, pantry doors and silverware drawers being opened when they would come home, and having the washer and dryer start up on their own. They don't remember any of this happening prior to me, the firstborn, being born. As far as I'm aware, they never sold my soul to any demons or anything, because we sure never had much luck or money. But as far as this activity goes, I don't really remember any of this taking place, and I feel like if I did, I wouldn't understand the magnitude of it all anyway. One instance, though, I do recall, is being around 7-ish years old, and being at a close friend's house. We were sitting on the floor of his bedroom playing Yu-Gi-Oh! He had one of those small Nickelodeon TVs in there, and the remote was on the floor. While we were playing, the remote was going back and forth under his bed and out toward us. We just stared at this in awe. Not realizing this was insane, we just went on about our lives as if nothing happened. Moving into later childhood and teen years, that was when things really picked up. Now, my sister had started to tell my mum and I that she was seeing shadows and felt uncomfortable. My mum also told us that she was seeing shadows and it was intermittent when things would occur. I had personally never seen what they were talking about and was thankful for that. All I recalled during that time was hearing footsteps outside of my room. We had since moved into a trailer due to some tragic life issues, and my mum would tell us that it was some animal under the floor causing the noises. I put full faith into that thought at the time, but looking back, there is just no way. The footsteps as well would be a constant until I moved out. I was in this home from 5 years old till about 22. Growing up, I would always stay the night at friends' houses for Halo LAN parties and try to recreate the food that we saw in Epic Mealtime. One of my friends had some paranormal things going on over there, and I cannot specifically tie these events to what I dealt with, but I just think it was a wild coincidence. So he had told us that he believed that a little girl was haunting his house, and had dealt with various things like noises and sightings. One specific night, I remember laying on the floor going to bed after another solid gaming sesh, and I could hear this Faith Carousel music. I put up with it for a few minutes and finally said, "Hey, could you shut off the volume on your DS? We can't sleep." Turns out, he was out cold, and that wasn't him. After I woke him up, we just sat there and stared at each other. He told me that he had toys in the attic and that he thought the little girl was playing with them. So, like most level-headed teenage boys, we decided to ghost hunt. At the time, the show on Sci-Fi, Ghost Hunters with the Taps team, was huge. We had this old-school recording device, and we would walk around the house asking questions, waiting for a response. We finally got the courage to crawl into the attic where the noises had been coming from, and began to have a classic EVP session. It was pitch black outside of the small little flashlight that we brought, and there were about 5 of us seated on the beams asking whatever came to our minds. After some time up there and no responses, that we could hear anyway, we wrapped up and we came down, but left the recorder up there for a period of time that escapes my memory. As we played the tape back, we got to the point where we shut the attic and were all back downstairs, and we actually caught a little girl saying what sounded like "mummy," and that was terrifying to us. I mean, we got what we wanted to find, but you don't really think that you would hit on anything. Fast forward a bit towards high school, my mum would ask me if I was moving shampoo bottles in her bathroom. And as a typical teenage jerk, I love doing pranks, but this wasn't me, and my sister isn't that kind of person at all. This would happen maybe once a month or so, it felt like. Along with this too, we would have lights turn on and off. My mum would find ways to debunk things as to not scare us. The other major incident though would be doors opening and closing, but it was only always my bedroom door for some reason. From where my dad sat most nights playing games well into the early morning hours, he could see my door. He would ask me in the morning if I happened to get up last night, and it was never me opening it. My mum had tried a few times to sage the house and cleanse it of the evil spirits, but this honestly did nothing. In fact, activity never slowed down or picked up, as if she had never tried it at all. In high school, I decided to follow in the family footsteps and start a career in fire or EMS. I took a high school course for EMT and graduated with my EMT cert. I joined a volunteer fire department shortly after graduating to get some experience with the hopes to go career eventually. About 3 years after high school, my nana passed away, and I was very close with her, and this was a sudden death as well. She had always been a big advocate for me, pushing myself and achieving my dreams. I had landed a job at a large ambulance company and was eager to start. I had everything laid out the night before, like the first day of school, ready for my first day. At around 4 a.m. while I was asleep in my room, I remember waking up to my door opening and a short figure standing in the doorway with no discernible features. As I stared at it, I wasn't scared or nervous and felt no malice. The door shut after 15 seconds or so, and I just sort of sat there for a bit, processing everything. This was the first time that I personally saw the shadow figures my family was talking about this whole time. That morning, I told my mum about what had happened, and she said that it wasn't her opening it. She suggested the thought that it could have been my nana checking on me on my first day. She was about 5'2" on a good day, so in my head that sort of added up with what I saw, and so I just went about life. Fast forward a few years, I'm now a firefighter paramedic in a career department, and I've proposed to my high school sweetheart. We just got our own apartment in a neighboring city, and we have our first pup, a wiener dog named Rocky. My fiancé was aware of some of the things that happened to me and my family growing up, but we had no idea that things were going to continue once I moved out. Our lives in this apartment pretty much consisted of me working my rotation of 24 hours on a 48 hours off, which is a pretty standard firefighter schedule, and Erica was going to school to become a dental hygienist. And this apartment is when I began to start connecting some dots that maybe it wasn't just the house that had haunting issues. Small things would happen here, and it was never when my fiancé was home. The apartment was about 900 square feet, so if there was a noise, I would definitely hear it. The things that I would experience here were lights turning on and off, but they wouldn't be in the room that I was in. For instance, the bathroom would turn on and I would be in the kitchen. The toilet would flush on its own, and we had motion sensor rope lights in our small walk-in closet in our bedroom that would turn on in the middle of the night. I remember feeling like someone was with me, but I never felt like it was harmful, just like I was in a crowded room in a sense. I remember hearing female whispers, but would often chalk it up to being in an apartment, even though most of the place would be vacant during the day with my neighbors being at work. During this time, I began to have very traumatic calls at work, the biggest event being one where 2 toddlers were unfortunately killed. This caused my mental health to decline, and there was a strong correlation with this and the activity that seemed to surround me. I began to go through therapy to help with coping through the work issues too. Outside of these small events, nothing drastic happened in the short time that we were at this apartment. We had set our sights on purchasing a home and starting a family. By this time, Erica had graduated and began working in her desired field, and I was as well. We had gone home shopping and found the perfect house for us in a neighboring city that was close to our jobs, family, and friends. Picking up from the apartment, we had moved into the new house and everything was perfect. We had finally made it. 2 kids from the trailer park with successful lives and a beautiful home. Things with work, however, continued to be difficult. I would go on several calls that involved horrible stuff, and working in healthcare during COVID was one of the most miserable and draining things I've ever done. My mental health was at an all-time low, and I was going to therapy on a weekly basis at this point. Through all of this, I never experienced anything at work, even though I spent so much time there. I feel like this was a catalyst for events that followed, though. Once I was at my lowest was when things escalated to new heights. One of the earliest signs something was still going on involved an artsy bathroom sign in a wall-mounted toilet paper holder. You see, my wife had this sign positioned right over this holder, and in theory, a normal household shouldn't have any issues. We heard a loud bang one day, though, and went to that small bathroom and saw the sign on the floor. Thinking this was odd since, no door was closed, no wind was coming through, we put it back up and we shut the door. About 2 minutes later, it fell again and landed directly on the holder. Then it hit me. This thing is still here, and it was still messing with me. This proceeded to happen over and over again in the next several weeks at completely random times, and each time striking the holder. It happened so much that it finally knocked the holder off the wall, and once it was removed, that sign hasn't moved in years since then. Things began to happen more in the open and during the day, too. The first instance that was in front of my wife was in our side living room area, and my wife was cleaning the floors. We had a sort of power surge in the kitchen, and her jacket flew off the back of the chair in the dining room, which is next to the kitchen. The table was directly between my wife and I, and we both saw this. Walking into the kitchen, and all the appliances had their times reset like a power surge, but nothing else in the house had any issues. This happened at around 10 a.m. She was obviously very freaked out at this point, and it was then when I couldn't really continue to hide it. I had found various reasons to play things off and cover for excuses, but this was unexplainable. At this point, I was still in monthly therapy sessions to deal with work-related issues. Mental health had improved quite a bit, but things seemed to come in waves, as if it was building up strength and feeding on my weaknesses or something. Looking back, it felt like it would build up over several months and get progressively more constant and severe, then sort of dissipate for random amount of times. It would ramp up with events like 1 to 3 times a month, and then once a week, then a few times a week, to daily even. It would usually build up in severity and then just back to nothing. I would be downstairs in our 2-story home gaming late at night and have lights turn on where I can see them. I would begin to jokingly talk into the open and say things like, "If you're going to turn the lights on, you can pay some of the bills, trying to make light of what was happening. My wife had asked questions on the history of it, and I explained since I was a young child I had issues. She began to ask if we could look into getting rid of this thing. I always told her, unless it's causing harm, I'm not messing with it. The absolute terror of the unknown was enough for me to just deal with it, I guess, but I was a decent horror buff at this point, even though my daily life was basically one. And when thinking about things escalating, I always thought of Paranormal Activity and the scene where they put down flour and now you know the footsteps were goat hooves. You just can't unsee that sort of stuff. I functioned heavily on the ignorance is bliss approach when it came to all of this, and it probably was not the best approach, but it worked for me at the time. Anyway, after this there was a lull of a few months, just long enough to give you some hope that things might be going back to normal. At this point, my wife and I began to start trying for a kid too. I know, the only thing to make this worse would be adding a kid, but here we go. We were having infertility issues though, and this would go on for about 2 years total. And some of the things that we experienced during this time are as follows. I apologize on the chronological order of events for these, but it all becomes muddy after a bit. So I told my wife goodnight and I went to play some World of Warcraft in my office room. The door was open down the hallway initially, and as I walked closer to the door, it just sort of shut in my face. I proceeded to open it and sit down like it never happened. I truly tried my best to ignore it and move on, but we both tried to function on the thought process of just don't feed into it and hopefully it will just go away. My wife experienced things being thrown 2 different times. To preface, she almost never saw things, or it would only happen when I was home, so for her to see something was pretty significant. The first one, though, was downstairs in our living room while I was upstairs gaming. I had a t-shirt on a coffee table and it was tossed across the room while she was sitting on the couch. And the second was when she was showering. She had our JBL speaker blasting Cardi B or something, and it was thrown off of the bathroom counter onto the floor. I was also home for this one, and I remember it quite clearly. These were obviously some of the bigger events, and weaved in were the constant footsteps and light switches turned on. It also figured out how to turn on the TV and the PS5 downstairs as well. We would wake in the morning and the TV or PlayStation would just be on and idling. Channels never would change and nothing would move on the screen though. Finally though, we got the dumb idea to try and record the downstairs activity while we slept one day. I bought 2 motion sensor cameras and had them set up near areas where things would often happen. When I had cameras recording, not a thing would happen though. When I turned them off, naturally would be the time when things would go bump downstairs. This, along with other examples, leads me to believe this was as intelligent of a haunting as you can pretty much get. Things again dissipated and picked back up like clockwork, and this next experience was worse than it had ever been before. The 3 big notable ones that I will mention are as follows. Again, I apologize for the correct order of events. The first one, though, will definitely be about my dogs. At this point, we now have 2 wiener dogs named Rocky and Sully. I wanted bigger dogs and she wanted smaller, so we compromised and got 2 smaller dogs. My wife went to work out and I was upstairs folding laundry. It was about 10:30 or 11 a.m. and she had gone for about 15 minutes at this point. My dogs were upstairs running around playing. I then heard in my wife's voice, clear as day, say, "Boys, stop barking, it's just Mama." And they stop in their tracks. I was so confused because I was 100% sure that she wasn't home. I called her real quick to see if she stopped back in because, I don't know, maybe she forgot something. And she told me that she had just pulled up to the gym. I left my room to investigate and I found nothing. That was the only instance of things for that day. The next one I can recall was another midday experience where I was home alone. It was around noon and I had just come downstairs for lunch. We had just recently had our anniversary and there was a balloon in the house, and the balloon had originally been in the dining room, and the exits of that room have maybe approximately a 1-foot slip for the doorway to go to the next room. But the balloon had left the room and was actively floating in front of me in the kitchen, slowly bobbing up and down, and it made its way to the back of the living room. For it to be able to leave the initial dining room, it definitely had to be physically moved. It wouldn't have any way to duck into the doorway either. I just stood there watching this in disbelief. But at this point, I had dealt with enough and decided to retaliate. So I grabbed a knife from the butcher's block and popped that balloon, put the knife back, and made some lunch, and I went upstairs. I had one of the dogs in my lap, watching some Twitch stream on my PC when I just felt a burning sensation on my leg. This was maybe about 15 minutes later. I was wearing long jogger-style pants and pulled them up to see what it was, and I saw 3 long scratch marks about 1 inch apart on my thigh. This was the point that scared the absolute heck out of me. And after that, I had just turned to open the room and apologize and said that we were even and I would like to continue to try and live in harmony. And nothing else happened that day. Now, the final experience in this stretch was a little more convoluted, I guess you could say. At work, I had been going through a rough patch with very traumatic calls. I would tend to have very vivid night terrors after these as well. This batch had consisted of a few cases involving juveniles and another person versus a train, and this specific dream was different though. I was in my home and heavy footsteps were sprinting for me. I was screaming my wife's name for help and banging on walls, but no noise was coming out. I felt as if my mouth was being held shut and I was using my hands to pry my mouth free. I had actually awoke and was screaming my wife's name when I woke up, which obviously really messed up the both of us. But this was the peak of the activity for this stretch. After this, things just seemed to die down for about a year. I had been talking with my therapist about the paranormal activity that I was dealing with, as it was a big factor in my mental health. Dealing with death at work all day and then coming home where I'm supposed to be able to unwind and relax was almost worse than working most days. We had discussed the possibility of what this could be and came up with a poltergeist style of haunting which definitely fit the description from what I could find. It basically is described as a malignant haunting that can interact with objects and feeds off of bad energy, which added up with all the depression that I had been going through with work and the infertility issues that we had, up to experiencing a miscarriage as well. At this point, we were able to have a happy, healthy baby girl in December of 2022. I don't really recall much going on at this point. I would say about 6 months into her being around was when things started to pick back up again, slowly as it had. Lights going on and off, footsteps, door handles jiggling to rooms that we're in. The go-tos of the haunting, I guess you could say. We had lightly discussed the issues of having our daughter to be in the same environment as this thing. Ever since the balloon incident, nothing violent or malicious had occurred, but I always had an uneasy feeling and just never felt alone. Around her first birthday, things began to pick up though, and we're back to a daily occurrence. I had tried to keep most of these to myself as to not spook my wife. I figured that if it was just me dealing with it, then I can just bear the burden and move on to keep the peace of everything in the household. For the first time in the history of this though, I was at work on my 24th and she was hearing things while I was away. She was putting our daughter down for bed and was hearing footsteps outside of her room and could see a shadow walking past the doorway. I remember her texting me as it was actively happening, saying that she was done with this, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. I was at the end with it too. But going back to the whole question of what the heck to do about any of this, that fear of the unknown just truly paralyzed me. I mean, what happens if we do something and it doesn't work? The house isn't haunted, my wife isn't haunted, it's me. It's followed me from 4 different houses in 4 different cities, and it has no signs of stopping. I had begun to do some research into what the heck I needed to do. I began even asking co-workers if they had anything like this, and they thought that I was absolutely crazy. Not that I blame them. My lieutenant kept asking if I had any photo or video proof, and I told him that I tried once, but never again. Once I knew what was in there, it would have been game over, to be honest. For Christmas, though, my wife bought me an LED gamer tag sign that would light up bright red. It actually came from overseas, so I had to Amazon order an American outlet adapter for it, and once it showed up, I plugged that bad boy in and it was absolutely beautiful. For the time being, I had it sitting on the floor in our computer room, and this specific night, I had told my wife goodnight and went to go and game it up a bit. I turned on the PC and shut the door, and went downstairs to get some G Fuel and snacks. As I was walking up the stairs, I could see a red glow from underneath the door. It turned out that the neon sign had been turned on while I was out of the room. I immediately unplugged it and went about my night. Before I left, I plugged it back in and turned the remote upside down on the table. This was my own little messed up experiment to see if it was moving the remote and turning it on or not, and in hindsight this was dumb, but I mean, here we are, right? That morning when I woke up, it was on. I then unplugged it again and I went to work. A few days had gone by with nothing, and I started to use that LED sign as a ghost gauge, basically. And one night, while I was at work, I got a text from my wife asking if I had left the sign on. I believe that I lied and told her yes for ease of mind, but I knew that I hadn't. After this, there was a stretch of a few nights my wife would work long hours and I was at home with our daughter. During these days, I would hear footsteps upstairs while we were downstairs, and I began to smell something, like perfume. It was the same perfume my nana would wear, and I hadn't smelled that since she passed away many years ago. It was around this time as well that I had also begun to hear a male voice with whispers of incoherent speech, but it always sounded like distant. Over these few days, the whispering got louder and louder, to the point where it was undeniable that I was hearing whispering, but it was always just gibberish. Nothing made sense when I would hear it, and most noticeably would be when I was putting our daughter to bed, and I was lying on the floor of her dark room till she dozed off. I would just hear it constantly. Not really knowing if it was just my nerves being absolutely messed up or if it was real at this point. I didn't tell my wife about this because, yet again, I felt that I should be the one to just bear the burden, but this definitely was my breaking point. For context, it's the beginning of February at this point. Out of a shot of desperation, I tracked down my pastor from my church growing up. My kid was at my parents' house for the day while I caught up on some yard work. I drove down to a local gas station, so I didn't have the conversation in the home, but we limited as much recognition of the entity in the home as much as possible, and this was my day of escaping to call for help. I remember calling him and asking if he had some time to speak. He did remember me from when I would go as a kid, and I told him that I felt that I had something paranormal going on in my life, and I asked if he could listen and hopefully help. He was a little taken aback, but he obliged and let me tell my entire story as I just have here. He had said, "Well, knowing you and the profession you're in, I'm leaning towards the fact that this is real and you aren't having a psychiatric issue or anything." He offered to come out a few days later. He told me that he was going to contact a specific group of people he knew in the Catholic Church, whose job was to deal with exorcisms and get some advice on how to approach this. He gave me the confidence that we would solve it, and at that, I began to cry. I had mixed emotions of terror and joy, hoping this would be the end, but having no clue how this would go. I spoke with my wife about the ordeal, and the pastor was going to come and help us. He asked that we all be present in the house during this ceremony. Once he showed up to the house, he greeted us with a smile and said that he was going to bless the house and us inside of it. We walked with him to each room as he was saying prayers and tossing holy water throughout. The entire time I was waiting for the absolute worst to occur. Every horror movie you see at this point always goes to the worst thing possible and somebody dies. Once he had walked through the house and blessed each room, we then went to the living room and locked hands and prayed. This process took about 45 minutes to an hour. I'm honestly not the biggest religious guy around and mainly went to church because of family, but I was all in on this because we had no other choice, really. Father Doug then gave me the number to what I can describe as the Exorcist hotline. He said if things persist or get worse, that I could call that number immediately and they would help. But it's been about, 6 months now at the time of sharing this, as I lay in my bed at work and things have stopped completely since that day. This is all 100% true, and I have zero proof of any of this, besides the accounts of my family and myself correlating, I guess. Some people are skeptical of ghost stories, and I'm just glad mine is over for now, to be honest. I was inspired to share this and put it down here and have this chapter of my life logged somewhere, so thanks for listening and thanks for the opportunity to share all of this. I want to start by saying that I really want to believe the things that I've seen or experienced were just my mind playing tricks on me, but it's happened too often for me to dismiss it entirely. I was raised to believe that ghosts don't exist, but I also grew up hearing ghostly experiences from the same people who told me that, so I never truly dismissed the idea of ghosts, I guess. I just feel like we all share a space, and as long as we don't bother each other, it's fine. That said, I want to share the first, very visible paranormal encounter that I had. It was March 2015, and I had just finished my finals that day. After returning from school, I took a nap, felt refreshed, and around 7 p.m. there was a power cut. Power cuts are fairly common where I live, so I decided to pass the time by walking along the pathway leading to our garage, which was between our house and our garden. It was dark, but the moonlight provided enough visibility for me to see. I could see the road outside of our property clearly, but where I was standing wasn't visible to anybody passing by. Like a typical teenager, I stood there listening to music, just doing random things, and after a while I was standing in front of the garage facing the road when I suddenly felt someone behind me. Before I could turn around, I sensed that this person was bending down towards my right side, and I could see a face behind my right elbow. I turned my head to look, and it was, well, me. I was staring at myself, but the other me had this huge grin that I'll never forget. Honestly, I've tried to mimic it in front of mirrors, but I physically can't actually do it. I instantly ran, or more like speed walked, back into the house, unable to explain what I had just seen. It was just me and my mother at home at the time, and it wasn't even past 8 p.m. When I told her what happened, she joked that it might have been one of the guys who got murdered on our property in the 1940s. Apparently, our property used to be a well-known garden open to the public, and according to one of my grandfather's friends, 3 murders had taken place in one day there, after which people stopped visiting the garden as much. After this incident, there were other small occurrences that I ignored. At one point, I stayed in the house alone for as long as 5 months, and even during those months, I would experience things randomly. I felt taps on my shoulder, heard clapping, and once I heard what sounded like whispers outside of our living room window. That particular incident actually made me stay awake in the living room until dawn, fearing that we were about to be robbed. That's because I'm more scared of humans than ghostly beings, but these tiny occurrences didn't really bother any of my family members. But then, something happened in early 2023. My grandmother, who has dementia and moved in with us, we always had someone attending to her so she wouldn't wander off, which she had tried to do multiple times. Grandma had her own sofa in the living room, and she would only ever sit there. This sofa was visible from the dining room, which was connected to my room, so whenever I left my room, I would see her sitting on a sofa. One evening, I decided to take a nap in my room while my mum sat with my grandma. It was just the 3 of us at home at the time. It was around 4 p.m, everything was fairly bright, but we still had our living room lights on, and instead of taking a nap, I was just sort of scrolling through my phone with my headphones on when my mum suddenly came running into my room. She frantically said something that I couldn't hear over my loud headphones. By the time I took them off, all I could hear was "Help, Grandma," and she ran out of my room toward the kitchen, trying to get to our backyard where my grandma was sitting on the floor. For some reason, she would always sit on the floor, and she was heavy enough that only my dad or I could lift her up. So I jumped out of bed and ran after my mum, but as I passed the living room, I saw my grandma sitting on the sofa. While running, I tried to ask my mum why she was heading to the backyard when Grandma was in the living room. But before I could finish my sentence, I stepped outside into the backyard and saw my grandma sitting on the floor. I stood still for a few seconds, confused, as my mum struggled to lift her up. I eventually composed myself and helped her, and that's when I realized that the grandma who was sitting on the sofa was wearing a completely different dress. I told my parents about this pretty much every evening and also brought up what I experienced back in 2015, and that's when my mum mentioned that she too had experienced some unexplainable things. Nothing as visible as what I had seen, but she had felt things, she said. Since that day, the activities have become more common occurrences. The creepiest one for me was when I felt as if someone was climbing onto my bed while I was on it. My bed was creaking in the same way it does when anyone climbs onto it. I thought that it could be my breathing, so I held my breath for a good 20 seconds and stayed completely still, but the bed was still creaking. I freaked out at that, jumped out of bed and turned on the lights, but as usual, there was nothing there. When I got back into the bed, the creaking stopped. My parents are usually very dismissive of the idea of ghosts, but even they have sensed things that they can't explain. All we know is that whatever or whoever this might be isn't harmful, I guess. Still, I would like to believe that my mind is just making things up. This happened 25 plus years ago. Me and friends, out at a park and boat dock on the Ohio River between Cincinnati and Louisville, probably 25 miles from there, were on a dock that goes probably 30 foot out into the river with a 10 by 10 platform at the end. We're on the Kentucky side, Indiana on the other side of the river. But we'd go to this park to sit on the dock and drink and just chat in a cool, quiet place. This was a regular occurrence about every other weekend. We were very familiar with the immediate surroundings, had rotating designated driver duties, and this happened on one of my weekends that I was stone cold sober. So, here's what happened. The group is drinking and having fun as usual. I'm babysitting, which usually entails keeping an eye on the top of the flood wall to see if police show up, and go to talk to them if they do, and make sure nobody falls into the river. About 2 hours in, I see a light on the other side of the river. Not bright, all the way on the other bank, or close to the bank at least. It's almost a mile away, so a little bit hard to tell, and downriver from us. I don't really care, but it's new, so I noticed it. Anyway, about 10 minutes pass and I'm watchdogging and I notice that the light is closer. I'm still not worried, but I'm responsible for a bunch of drunk people, so I'm now adding it to the very short list of things that have my interest. Another 10 or 15 minutes passes and the light has moved up my list of things that I now care about. It's definitely closer now. I'm seeing the reflection of the light on the surface of the water, so I know it's a physical object. I think maybe it's a boat. Bass boats and such have to have marker lights here, and this seems to be about the right height for that. It's maybe about 3 feet above the water, best guess at this distance, but I alert a couple of people that there's something going on that may necessitate our sudden absence. 10 minutes later, and it's now a solid 2 on my care list, and second only to drunk friend about to fall in the river, so I'm watching pretty intently. And all at once, a few thoughts come crashing together to make me do something. So, a bass boat coming up river against the current would make noise, but I've heard nothing. A boat has its marker lights on the back on a pole, so the light would show the back end of the boat that it's attached to. There's nothing under this light but water. I can see the water under the light, and it's calm. Dead flat calm in a river that is 3/4 of a mile wide at that point. Even if I maybe couldn't hear it, maybe couldn't see it for whatever reason, a boat would create a wake if it's going against the current of the river and all the way across it, and I'm seeing flat glass under its light. Not only no boat wake, but no huge flowing river ripples that were clearly visible on the rest of the surface. No variation in brightness, constant light, color was almost white leaning towards yellow just a bit. And that was it. We were leaving. I tell my friends that it's time to go. We're heading out. Much hullabaloo ensues because drunk people, but we're moving. We walk back to the dock and head for land. Everybody's on land. I'm in the back because that's my job. And alright, everyone's up on the hill towards the parking lot in the car. I look back, and the light is noticeably closer this time. The light is also moving faster than it has been for the last hour or so. So, we go and we move. We climb the hill. Everyone is getting in the car except my best friend. We're standing on the top of the flood wall, looking down on the river, the dock and the light. The light is now dead center over the middle of the 10 by 10 platform at the end of the dock. But there's nothing under it but the dock. It's lighting up the area under it, and it's honestly just a light attached to, well, nothing. It's just a light, approximately the size of a light bulb, I guess, probably a bit smaller, lighting up the place that we were just sitting. And now it's moving toward us, crossing above the walkway from the platform toward land and us. And it's moving faster than it was over the water, probably a solid human walking speed now. We all dive into the car at this, and we all just get the heck out of there. My question for all of you guys is, what the heck did we see? What was it doing? Why did it care that we were there at that place that we've been dozens of times before? I'm used to having a probably or even possible explanation for things, but this thing that we saw, I just don't have anything, but I know what I saw, and I don't know what to call it. Several years ago, I had a very quick trip to Denver planned, 23 hours total, to visit a friend before they moved away. I was young, broke, and working a pretty terrible entry-level job, so it was the best that I could do with my one day off. I went straight from work to the airport and got into DIA around 11 p.m. I was bunking on the couch of an old college friend, and they lived 30 to 40 minutes from the airport. Fortunately, the light rail recently had been extended out to the airport, and my friend actually lived near the light rail line. I had taken the light rail often when living in Denver myself, but was not familiar with the newer additions. I barely made it to the train before it set off, grateful to not have to wait around for another half hour at that time of night. It was nearing midnight as the train pulled into a brightly lit Union station. I looked around for my connection, but it was nowhere to be found, not realizing that the connecting line was not there. Fortunately, I was able to flag down security and they pointed me in the right direction. A few blocks away, there was another brightly lit station, separated by roughly 200 yards. Unlike the stations, there were hardly any lights, just some lights spilling in from either side where the train platform stood. I was only traveling with a backpack, so I was able to move pretty quickly, moving out of Union Station and towards the other platform, hoping that I was going to make my next train. As I got further away from the station, and my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed a large figure standing in the middle of the sidewalk ahead of me. I quickly gauged my surroundings and realized that there were no other paths unless I walked in the road. I decided to keep on the path and do my best to come across with a "I see you and I'm not scared" attitude. As I drew closer, I could make out a tall, muscular man, probably in his 20s or 30s, I would guess, and as I got closer, I made eye contact to let him know that I recognized his presence, and he was already staring right at me, mumbling to himself. As I passed by him, I could hear what he was mumbling. He was not speaking to me, but instead he was speaking about me, and as I walked past him, he then began to follow me. I began to walk fast, and he began to walk faster. All the while, he was saying things like, "Oh, look at that body, she's so fine, I want to feel that body," along with other sexual and crude comments about me, all being muttered to himself. The second station was still another 100 yards or so away, and there was nowhere that I could go in between. I pulled out my cell phone and rang my dad, desperate for him to answer. The call went to voicemail, but I pretended that he picked up. As soon as I began talking, though, the man spoke to me for the first time and said, "Oh girl, I didn't mean you no harm," and the footsteps faded back. I kept up the fake conversation for a moment longer, before looking back, and he was nowhere to be found. Like I mentioned previously, I had looked around for places that I could escape and could not find any. I'm confident too with his size that if he had done anything, I would not have stood a chance. I burst into the light of the station, barely made my train, and ultimately missed my stop because I was so shaken up and had to ride the train back around. I finally rested my head on a pillow at my friend's at around 2 a.m. and never to travel alone at night ever again. I recently heard a story here that brought back old memories of my dad's crazy ex-girlfriend. This took place when I was around 8 or 9 years old, so I guess it would have been the year of like 1997. So my parents had gotten divorced several years prior, so me and my little sister, 2 years younger, used to stay with our dad every other weekend. One day, he introduced us to this new girlfriend, Rachel, who was a tall blonde woman that had apparently won some kind of beauty pageant or something. I remember those first months of getting to know Rachel as fun. She seemed like a nice lady, to be honest. I also think my initial impression of her was helped by the fact that she had a rather cuddly grey parrot and a pet raven that could talk, which of course made my younger self quite ecstatic. But after a while, things started to change. I began to notice that she could be a bit odd at times, saying weird things or acting a bit strangely. We started seeing her less frequently when staying with our dad, and then one day, he told us that they'd broke up and that we wouldn't be seeing her anymore. He also told us that we shouldn't talk to her or go home with her if she showed up at school. Not long after that, Rachel really started harassing my dad. She would randomly turn up at places we went to visit during weekends, trying to talk with us. She called him non-stop on the phone when we were at home, crying, making threats. It usually didn't stop until he pulled the plug even. Years later, I found out that she had even threatened to kill me and my sister on several occasions, and that Dad got a restraining order in the end. Rachel also keyed my dad's car, broke into his company to trash it, and stole a lot of money that he never got back. She even started writing threatening letters to my mum. My parents have always been good friends ever since the divorce, and it all culminated with a letter from the authorities. A letter accusing my dad of, well, lots of horrible things done to children. I still vividly remember how Mum sat us down in our room, holding the letter, a deep look of concern on her face, asking if Dad had ever done anything inappropriate to us, which of course he never had. It later turned out, though, that it was Rachel who had falsely accused him of everything in that letter, in an attempt to prevent him from seeing us. I remember feeling really angry about this, and upset that she had gone to such lengths. The last memory, though, I have of Rachel was a few weeks before Christmas. We were staying at my dad's place over the weekend. It was a 2-story apartment complex with a large window spanning an entire wall, floor to ceiling, in the living room where we had just sat down to watch TV. Next to the window, there was a glass door leading onto a stone patio, bordering a lawn that ended with a tall hedge. And on this particular day, the outdoor lights had been switched off, which means that it was pitch black outside as the intro to Superman started playing. A while into the episode, I suddenly heard a strange, sharp noise coming from the window. It sounded like something was clawing on the glass in an attempt to get in. The sofa that I was sitting on was placed right in front of that window, so I had my back toward it when I slowly turned around to look over my shoulder, heart thumping in my chest, hair standing on end as if I was being watched. But all that came into view was a pitch-black darkness lurking behind my own reflection. By this point, Dad had also heard the sound and gotten up to turn on the patio lights. When the outside suddenly flooded with light, I found myself staring into the face of a smiling blonde woman peering into our living room. Need I tell you that I screamed? Both me and my sister flew up from the couch like it had been scorched with fire and ran behind our dad. When I looked toward the window again, I saw Rachel with both of her hands up against the glass, tightly cupped beside her face as she was trying to look inside. The patio door was right next to her, and I tugged on Dad's shirt and whispered if the door was locked when she reached toward the handle. And that millisecond of doubt flashing across my dad's face, it still haunts me to this day. Rachel truly looked like a madwoman as she furiously jerked on the handle in an attempt to get in, briefly pausing to peer through the glass now and again. I remember thinking Dad looked oddly calm as he ushered us around a corner wall, telling us to stay out of sight as he walked toward the patio door. We begged him not to go outside, thinking that she could have had a knife hidden somewhere or something. He opened up a small crack with the door, firmly holding onto the handle and asking what the heck she was doing in his backyard. She tried to get him to let her in, putting on a big smile, tossing her hair, but Dad obviously wouldn't budge, telling her to leave or he would call the cops. To which she eventually conceded, leaving a bunch of Christmas presents behind. When Rachel was out of sight from the window, Dad went out to make sure that she was gone, picking up what she had left behind on his way back. None of us wanted anything to do with the presents. Something just felt really off about them. And so, in the end, they ended up fully wrapped and in the trash. This happened a long time ago now, and comes from a brief yet highly disturbing encounter. Despite it being brief, it would eventually leave a long-lasting impression on me, and will likely remain the most messed up thing that I've ever experienced. My story began when I was a 14-year-old boy. To give some context, I was one of those part of the group but not one of the group types, shy and sort of reserved. I had friends, but not much beyond school hours. So when one of my friends wanted me to hang out with her, it made a welcome change to my quiet after-school routine of video games. We walked back to hers from school, and she invited me into her house. As I walked in, I saw whom I quickly assumed was her dad, with his back to me preparing food. This was the first time I'd been introduced to him, and my first impression would quickly be, putting it very mildly, not great at all. As my friend introduced me, he turned around to face me holding a large kitchen knife. Suddenly, he lurched towards me as if he stumbled forward, yelling, "Whoa!" He quickly turned the knife, pushing the handle quite hard into my chest. He then smirked with the eeriest expression on his face and said, only joking. My heart was pounding, and inwardly I was freaking out, and while I tried to nervously laugh it off, I'm sure my face clearly said otherwise. My friend just laughed it off as Dad fooling around and led me to their living room, but as I sat down, I couldn't shake the uneasy gut feeling I had now. I tried to shake it off and talk to my friend, but her dad promptly entered the living room. They had music playing moderately loud on a stereo, and he cranked the volume to a level that sounded like a live band was in there with us. My friend followed him to the kitchen and soon returned. She told me that she had to go to the store to get something for him and asked if I wanted to wait for her as it wasn't too far. Given the rather creepy encounter, my gut instinct was having none of it and I wouldn't be ignoring it. So I quickly got up and I left with my friend for the store. I cannot say exactly how the rest of the day went, as I really cannot remember, but I do know that I didn't return to that house again. I wouldn't speak of what happened after that for quite some time and just chalked it up to a really freaky interaction, locking it away in my mind. However, it wouldn't end there. He would set foot into our house a year later, dropping my friend off at a family party that we were having. I didn't interact with him then, though my dad offered him a beer and later recalled how he just stood there in a corner alone, watching everyone. I would see my friend's dad for the third time, a couple of years later, this time on TV, as the face of the man convicted for the abduction and murder of a woman who went missing a week prior. I was stood there, right as the story broke of who he was. I will never, for as long as I live, forget the sensation of my blood turning to ice in my veins. But my parents later commented how they literally saw the color drain on my face in that moment. Yet in the days that followed, it only got worse. He would go on to confess while in custody to the abduction and murder of a woman who had been missing for 20 years by that point. Following corroborations of things that he had said previously, along with expert analysis, this led the police to believe that he may have actually been a prolific serial killer. He was soon probed as a potential suspect in almost half a dozen unsolved missing person cases. However, due to a lack of evidence and further confession, his involvement in these remain, unclear. My mind still occasionally wanders to that first encounter, and even though his choice of victims seemed to be women, I can't help but think about that music cranked up so loud, how my friend asked me if I wanted to wait for her at the house with him. If I had stayed, what would have happened to me, if anything at all? Was there a part of him that was curious, wondering about switching things up a little? Or was that knife held to my chest truly just the harmless joke of a serial killer? This took place back in 2019 when I was 11. My grandparents live in a large Victorian-styled home on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The building was made in the late 1800s, so it has that classic old building look to it. Me and my family go down there occasionally from our home up near Bellingham, Washington, and in early September of that year, my family decided that they wanted to pay my grandparents a visit. I was excited to see my grandparents, but not so much to go to the house. Up until that point, nothing out of the ordinary had happened in that house. The only thing it did was creep me out, especially if I was alone. The first day that we were there, though, nothing really out of the ordinary happened. My grandparents and I did our annual game of Clue, a murder mystery board game. We enjoyed dinner, and that was basically about it. Little did I know, though, that when I went to sleep that night, that tomorrow would be anything but ordinary. When I got up the next day, I was excited because I was a die-hard Seahawks fan, and today was going to be their first game of the season. Outside it was warm and muggy, so in my room, which was one of the 2 rooms on the 3rd floor, I had the window open with the fan on to let all the hot air out. Later that day, my dad came up to my room and said that he and everyone else was going to go on a walk. I acknowledged him by nodding, glued to the Seahawks game that was on my tablet screen. He then left and shut the door behind him. And what happens next still terrifies me to this day. About 10 minutes later, I heard what I thought to be my mum yelling from downstairs, somewhat annoyed. I stood up and turned the fan off next to the window, so as to listen if my mum was actually calling me, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it again. My mum was definitely calling my name. I opened the door, frustrated that I was missing part of the game, and yelled an annoyed, "Yeah?" When there was no response, I yelled down from the 3rd floor stairs again, "Yeah?" Then my mum called back and said something like, "Want to show you this," or something like that. I couldn't really make out what she was saying. Annoyed, but not wanting to ignore my mum, I hurried down the stairs onto the 2nd floor. "Where are you?" I called, genuinely not knowing where she was. "Here," she said. It sounded like it was coming from the 1st floor, but something was off. Her voice sounded very muffled and weird. I played it off as just me being paranoid, so I walked down to the 1st floor, now getting a little bit scared. "Mum?" I said. No reply. I searched almost every room and no one was there. That only left one room, the basement. Now, there was no way in heck I was going down there though, so I started heading back towards the stairs when, all of a sudden, the basement door swung open. I yelled, spinning around, but nobody was there. Then I heard footsteps walking down the basement stairs. Someone was definitely there. I then heard my mum say again, "Here," in that same weird muffled voice. In that instant, I got chills down my spine. Something definitely wasn't right. I turned and ran as fast as I could up the stairs and onto the second floor. I ran across the kitchen to the narrow staircase that led up to the third floor. Then I stopped dead in my tracks, paralyzed with fear. At the top of the staircase was what I can only describe as a shadow-like person, without a face, saying in my mother's voice, "Here." I screamed at the top of my lungs and practically threw myself down the stairs and straight out the front door. I then waited outside near the trees, glancing over my shoulder every 2 seconds before my family finally came back from their walk. When I told them what happened, they didn't believe me at first, but seeing as I was crying and looking genuinely freaked out, they told me that they believed me. I don't know if they were telling the truth or they just wanted me to feel more comforted, but either way, there was no way that I was sleeping in that building that night. After about 10 minutes of reasoning with them, I decided that I would be more comfortable if I slept with my parents that night. This incident still haunts me to this day, and I rarely, if ever, sleep in a room alone in that house anymore. I'm wondering if anyone in Hilton Head Island has ever experienced anything like this. It was a family vacation last summer. My siblings and I were all in separate condo complexes in Palmetto Dunes. We're each spending our nights with our families in our rentals. My older sibling and I are closer to the end of the resort, almost to Leamington. My younger sibling, though, is closer to the center, not far from the security roundabout after the tennis courts and all. So, it's night and we all meet at my younger sibling's place for drinks and some dessert. She tells us that somebody is knocking at around 2:30 in the morning and that apparently it woke her up, naturally. She initially thought it was one of her teenage boys who had gone out for whatever reason and forgot the code to get back in, but eventually finds them both sound asleep. The knocking continues. Now scared, she wakes up her husband. At that point, though, it stops. He gets up to check it out, but he doesn't find anyone at the door, so they chalk it up to a drunkard just getting the places mixed up or something. We basically all shrugged our shoulders and we thought the same. Now, I forgot about the story entirely until I was driving back home a few days later, and here is where it gets weird, to the point of me being spooked out as I even share this. It's about 2:45 or so in the morning, and I'm having a bit of a nightmare, a bad one in fact. I'm with my ex-wife and nobody is around, but we're getting along and discussing bills or something in her house. It's a quiet summer night and she decides to go upstairs to take a shower. And while she's there, someone starts knocking on her front door. It's loud and continues. Our kids aren't around and I know that they're gone for the night, so I open the door to find no one there. I erroneously decide to investigate, walking through the side yard and around the back. And it was there where I discover the sliding glass door to the deck open. I yell to my ex that somebody must be in the house, but then I wake up, and somebody is literally banging on the condo door. It scared the heck out of me. My instinct kicked in. I checked my phone for messages, thinking that perhaps one of my sisters is trying to get a hold of me for an emergency or something. I wake up my wife, and then it stops. I quickly go into the kids' bedrooms, and they're all sound asleep. Finally, I walk quickly to the dining area window and I peek out, but there's no one there. There isn't even a sign of anyone having been there. The front deck area is well lit, and it's as silent as one would expect it to be at like 3 in the morning. The next morning, we left to head back home, and my sister's story of the knocking at the door right around the same time hit me out of nowhere, sending a huge shiver down my spine. I don't know if it was a real person or a ghost, and I don't think it really matters. All I hope is that I never have to find out. So my search and rescue pal and climbing partner were driving through the Ojai Valley. I'm not sure what highway that we were on. It was 2002 to 2003 though, and we were taking a new way to a new destination. We had just passed a sign saying Ojai Valley. There were no exits or on-ramps for many miles either way. We were on a 2-lane highway that only headed one direction. There was an overpass, but no way to access it from where we were. We came across a small red hatchback that had been in a terrible wreck. It was in the slow lane of the highway. There was no one else around, nor did we see any other vehicles during our time at the wreck. The front end of the car was smashed in, and the driver was very clearly dead. Blood was on the passenger window and windshield. The car looked like a bomb went off. Its contents were all over the road. There were 2 small animal carriers nearby in the debris. We didn't see anything moving in either of them, nor did we feel safe getting out of our rig. It was a bizarre scene, really. The vehicle had clearly ran into something huge, but there were no other vehicles, nor any dead animals or blood on the road, anywhere. We were both wilderness first responders, climbing partner who was also in med school. Neither of us felt safe there, and really we knew that there was nothing that we could do anyway. We didn't have cell phone reception at the location, but had stopped just trying to wrap our heads around what we could do and what had happened. In the end, we decided to take the next exit and see if we could get some cell service. Before we could do so, a military chopper was overhead and one of their crew descended on a line. I have no clue what we witnessed, what the vehicle hit as they were in the slow lane, but it had to have been massive given the damage and the explosion of the car contents. I also have no idea why the military was there. I mean, in search and rescue, we trained with military at times, and occasionally they would assist with Coast Guard choppers that had infrared to pick up body heat. In a few times over my time with SAR, Army choppers that were nearby assisted with a capsized boat and evacuating some folks for us. So maybe these guys were in the area and they were able to respond or something? No idea. Again, we both searched the internet years later to see if there was any mention of what we saw, but we never found a thing about it. Also, there wasn't any car part debris indicating another vehicle had been involved, nor was there blood on the road like an animal had been hit. The car was right at the overpass. The car was in the slow lane, headed toward the proper direction. No tire damage. All doors closed, except the hatchback that was likely blown open by the massive damage to the front end, I would suppose, but it was almost like they had hit a massive invisible wall going like 60 miles per hour. So, this is a happy story, I guess you could say, from a time as a wilderness therapist or a guide. Slightly creepy still, and definitely pretty bewildering. Now, I realize that wilderness therapy programs, they get a lot of well-deserved hate. I worked for one that appeared ethical, and I never saw anything other than amazing care and compassion. We would take kiddos, largely very affluent kiddos with famous parents, into the wilderness for 4 weeks at a time. Doing therapy every night around a campfire, kiddos would make their own meals with the dry goods that the company supplied. Kiddos didn't have tents, but did have a 4x6 piece of tarp that we taught them to fashion into a tent using knots, rocks, and their walking stick at the entrance. Us guides and therapists just had our sleep sacks and bivy bags. The agency also had some scholarship for non-wealthy families who had kiddos who really needed help. All of the kids, rich or not, had spent a few months or maybe even years either living in a penal institution or mental health facility at least. Now, one of my favorite kids was the Cocoa Puff kid. His family had gotten a scholarship as he was placed with them after it was determined that his mother couldn't care for him due to hoarding and other mental illnesses. Even though the kid was 12, he was absolutely tiny and looked about 8. He was also having a rough transition, largely as he had been caring for multiple siblings and felt lost without them. I packed the kids' backpacks with group gear, and packs were heavy, maybe 40 to 60 pounds each. This kid had fetal alcohol effects, if not syndrome, and he maybe weighed like 65 to 75 pounds. I always redistributed his share of the supplies to the older and bigger kids or myself. It just didn't seem fair to make him struggle when he had some able-bodied kiddos around. He earned his moniker too, as every time that we would get to a big hill, he would say, "I could make it up this hill if I had Cocoa Puffs. Cocoa Puffs have 14 vitamins and minerals." He was serious too, and I silently cracked up every time, to be honest. He had been in charge of walking to the store and buying food for the house with the meager funds that they had. He was smart and based his choices on nutritional value. There were no labels on the dry goods that we had given them, though. Rice, beans, etc. They did have cheese and peanut butter, but we had no idea if there were vitamins and minerals in any of them, to be honest. Anyway, the last week of the trip, we would place the kids in areas about a mile or so off from the camp, in their own spaces, far away from each other and based on how comfortable we were with their capabilities. Cocoa Puff Kid was a quick learner and smart well beyond his years, so we placed him across a brisk stream that later ate one of the trekking poles, and we would go check on the kids daily. The kids, they wouldn't necessarily see us checking in on them during these check-ins, but we would get a visual on them and had a system set up where each of them had a sort of mailbox to leave us a note if things were going bad or whatever. I checked on Cocoa Puff Kid daily, as no one else wanted to cross the raging river, or stream. It was raging though, and I was low woman on the totem pole, so every day I checked on him, and there was wildlife at this site too. And one day a hawk was sitting on his hiking stick that was part of his tent, and he was talking to it, sitting a few feet away. I watched, mesmerized, not believing what I was seeing for probably 30 minutes. Now one day, a large doe and her newborn were chilling at this site, the baby laying a few feet from his tent while Mum grazed. And that was kind of insane, and I've never seen anyone in my decades in the wilderness have this kind of connection with any animal. When we reunited as a group, Cocoa Puff Kid shared his stories of his encounters. He had written them in his journal as well. The other boys started to give him a bit of a hard time, and we had a strict no-lying policy, and I told the group what I had witnessed. The kid had a true gift, it seemed. I have no idea what happened to any of those kids, but I do hope Cocoa Puff Kid followed his dreams to be a game warden. A happy and wholesome, but slightly creepy backwoods story, I guess. Also of note too is that 2 of the therapists had brought their dogs, and the dogs always slept with the Cocoa Puff Kid. They weren't supposed to, but every morning we would wake up with those dogs snuggled up next to him or by his shelter. I have no idea how that kid was capable of doing these things, but I can attest to the fact that I saw it, and I don't know what to make of it. Throughout this story, I would like for all of you to please keep in mind that I was 20 years old and very, very naive. You're going to think that I was stupid, and I was. I'm probably lucky to be alive, and man, do I know that. I kick myself whenever I think about this day. I just wanted to get some other opinions, and I don't know, maybe I was wrong about him. So, about 20 years ago, I was walking down the road in a not-so-great area. It was summertime and I was dressed appropriately for the heat, shorts and a tank. I'm very thin and was downright skinny then, and got mistaken for a sex worker more times than I care to admit. This may or may not be important to the story, I'm really not sure, but I thought that I would mention it. So anyways, like I said, I was walking to pick up my son from daycare, and as I was going about my way, a truck full of men started to catcall and follow me. They turned around several times to yell at me out of the window, and I was getting a little bit nervous about it. I was passing a gas station parking lot, and a man not much older than myself stopped in a nice car and asked if I would like a ride. He didn't seem scary, and honestly, he was attractive, so I said okay, and I got into this car. So, I get into the car with him, and he asks where I'm going. I tell him that it's about a mile straight down the road that I'm on, and he starts out going the wrong way, and just tells me that he needs to turn around. I pay little mind to this. He starts to ask me about myself, so I tell him I was escaping a DV situation and was staying in a women's shelter nearby. I was telling him how closely my activities were monitored, and that I was due to pick up my son any minute. And honestly, I think this may have actually been what saved me. At some point, I notice that he takes another wrong turn, but I don't know the area all that well, so I point it out, and he says that he's taking a shortcut or something, and I just go back to talking like an idiot. But then I get a whiff of something. I know that that smell now is the smell of death or decomposition. I know this for sure now, in fact. I didn't back then, but I turned around and looked into the back seat, looking for spoiled food or something that would cause this. The car is absolutely spotless, though. I bring up the smell, and he brushes it off and changes the subject. But for some reason, the smell just started getting stronger. Me, being the young idiot that I was, brings it up again. "What is that smell?" I say. And he says that he doesn't know. Probably something that he forgot to take out and has gone bad or whatever. When I tell you guys, though, that there was not a crumb in that vehicle, I was absolutely baffled. But eventually, he drops me off safe to my destination. He doesn't tell me his name, ask for my number, or give me his. And I don't think much of it until, well, much later when I then smell that smell again. But this time, I know what it is, and it triggers the memory of that guy in that car that day. This was probably 2005 in Covington, Kentucky, and I'm very sure that him being aware that not only would I be missed, but I would be missed quickly and my movements would be tracked very specifically. I think that that was the only reason that I made it back out of that car that day. This is going to be a bit of a long one, so buckle in. This is a story about my family and myself. I'll do my best to remember all of the events and the details that I can. I apologize if some of this is hard to understand, but I'm just trying to sort of relive my childhood to tell this story. So, the year is 1993. My parents have 3 kids at the time, my older sister, my older brother, and me. 2 more sisters come in later on, but we are closing on the house, my parents' house, and this is where it all started. So as closing was coming to an end, my parents were asked if they had any more questions about the property. My mum asked Mr. G, the seller, if anyone had died in the house. Random question, I know, but Mr. G's response was, "Why? Are you scared of ghosts?" I guess that was the end of their closing, and so we eventually moved in. It was a hood city, but our neighborhood was one of those movie neighborhoods where all of the houses looked the same except for the one that we had just bought, and everyone knew everyone and everything that went on in that place. All the houses in the neighborhood were single-story, two-bedroom, a one-bath house with a kitchen and living room and a dining room. Mr. G added to the house that we had bought when he owned it, and it was a two-story, five-bedroom, three-bathroom with a beauty salon and a workshop attached to it too. I think Mr. G's wife was a hairstylist or something. So, our house was the biggest in the neighborhood. Anyway, we get settled in the first week. My bedroom was supposed to be the last room on the left upstairs, but from day one I was absolutely terrified of that room. So me and my brother shared a room instead, the last room on the right. After we get unpacked and settle in, we decided to take a bit of a stroll around the block. We closed up the house, turned the lights off, shut the front door, and head out on our walk to interact with the neighborhood. We made our way around the 5 roads that made up our community, and as we made our way back to the house, we could see it in the distance. All of the lights were on in the house, and the front door was open. My mum made us stay back, about 2 houses up, while my dad went and checked the house. When my dad gave the clear, my mum called the police to make a report, and they also checked the house and didn't find anything or anyone, so it was just let go. Now, I believe that this was one of the first signs of paranormal activity in this house, and so that's why I brought it up. I don't know how much time had passed, but it was a short time, maybe a couple of days or maybe a week at most. But we did the typical welcome to the neighborhood housewarming party at our house, and a lot of neighbors came to visit and party and all that. Our next door neighbor Bill was hesitant about coming inside and stayed on the front porch, but eventually came inside and sat on the couch and drank some beer. One of the downstairs bedroom that was attached to the living room was mine and my brother's playroom or TV or Sega Nintendo room. My hamster cage was in there too, but during this party I decided to put my hamster in the ball, and Bill was loosened up by this time. And well, said hamster rolled around in this ball and made it into the living room, and Bill got quiet. My parents noticed this about Bill and asked him if he was all right. I guess Bill wasn't accustomed to hamsters and their toys and all that he had seen was a ball, but Bill said that if that ball moves one more time, that he was leaving and that he won't be back. Well, about that time, my hamster turned into the Flash and just sort of took off in this ball. Bill literally flew out the door and he just went home. He stuck to his word years later until we moved, and he just would not enter our house and would only come in the driveway or yard sometimes, but rarely he would come onto the front porch, even after my mum told him that it was a hamster in a ball. Well, we were there a few months living the 90s family life, and my mother is outside and starts a conversation with the lady across the street. We called her and her husband Meemore and Pawpaw, and this is when Meemore informs my mum that 2 ladies had actually died in our house from cancer, Mr. G's wife and daughter. Meemore also goes to say that Mr. G was a bit of a weird guy and had secret rooms built into the house behind bookshelves and all that. Secret doors and rooms full of old school firemen set up stuff, like firemen's axes, fire hoses on a reel, behind a wall, she believed. It was the wall that the stairs were on, apparently. Some people knew about the secret rooms, so I guess it wasn't entirely secret, but my mum invited Meemore over one day, and she was going around the house just showing us some of the rooms that were turned into regular rooms before Mr. G sold us the house. One was in our computer room, which had the stairs to go upstairs, and right beside the stairs was a built-in bookshelf. That was apparently one of the secret rooms that went under the stairs and into our laundry room. The bookshelf had been screwed shut, but if you went through the door on the other side, you could see the back of the bookshelf that still had hinges and was screwed shut to the wall on the other side so that it couldn't be opened. The upstairs bedroom, my bedroom, you could also see a faint crack on the wall that went over to the stairs in the shape of a door. It was sealed, and Meemore told us that that's where Mr. G apparently kept his safe. Well, I started elementary school, and I used to walk to school that was about maybe half a mile away through the woods. Very close, but everything seemed fine, and I had 2 younger sisters and all that. But around 4th grade, I started noticing when I got home from school just about every day that my mum would be sitting in our van, and she had a sort of little 90s handheld TV and would go to Winn-Dixie and buy an Inquiry magazine and just sit there. I used to get mad because I wanted to go to the store with her, but it was a daily occurrence. During this time, I was in elementary school, and we would witness things or experience things happening, like doors opening or closing inside the house, and stuff like this. It would be slow as well, like a draft. Not fast swinging, opening, or slamming shut, but they still definitely moved. Things were moved too. My dad played it off as drafts in the house and forgetting that we left so-and-so here or there, but I didn't know this at the time, and my mum was stressing and freaked out by this. My mum was huge on psychic Sylvia Browne on the Montel show, and at this time I'm in middle school, and my brother and I came home walking home from school one day and noticed a bag with our DVDs sitting beside the trash can, so we went to go and get them. My mum met us at the door, and we asked why they were out there, and she said that psychic Sylvia Browne said today that if you have horror movies in your house, then you are allowing the devil to enter your home. She made us throw them back out, but eventually we snuck them back into our bedroom. Me and my brother shared a bedroom at that time too. Later in the evening, my mum is still making small talk about Sylvia Browne, and one of our yearly chores was that my brother and I hung the Christmas lights up. Well, we were teens and preteens at this point, and a bit lazy, so this year we decided that we hated doing it, so we left the lights up, and it's like months past Christmas now. And during one of Sylvia Browne's episodes, my mum starts screaming at me and my brother to go and take the Christmas lights down because it's apparently bad luck to leave them up all year and something to do with Satan. This is when my brother, I didn't mention that he's 4 years older than me, but he is, makes the comment to my mum that, yeah, well, this house is already evil. Sometimes I feel like I'm getting my hair pulled and no one's there, and sometimes I hear people walking up the stairs and no one's there. My mum just burst into tears with my brother and says the same thing happens to her, and also that she has been pushed down the stairs apparently, and says that that's why she sits in the van every day, all day long, because she's so scared to be in the house by herself. So, when we leave for school, she would be right behind us to go sit in the car all day, allegedly. And at this time, my mum and dad got divorced for whatever reason. I never got into it, but my dad moved back in with his parents. I was kind of jealous at this point because my mum and brother were talking about paranormal stuff happening to them, but nothing ever really happened to me. I was pretty much unbothered by spirits, to be honest. My mum started calling them spirits instead of ghosts or demons. My guess is that she was hoping to ease her own mind or something, but I was going to leave this part out, but I'll tell it anyway just in case it's meaningful in some sense. I was home alone one day, and my mum and brother and little sister went to the grocery store or something, and I, for reasons I won't get into, tried to end myself with a belt. I remember seeing the light, but I don't know, I didn't make it that far, and I woke up on the ground with a massive headache and the belt was broken. I never spoke of this again, but looking back, I can only think that the spirit saved me for whatever reason. I got to my feet and ripped the collar off of my shirt, and when my family got home, I acted like nothing had happened, but my mum asked me what happened to my neck, and I quickly got the ripped shirt and told her that I was in the attic and my shirt got caught on a nail and almost choked me. By the way, our house has 3 attics, one on the front porch, one in the dining room downstairs, and one upstairs with the closet that was originally supposed to be my bedroom. Anyways, now my brother is curious about the attic, so we decided to go up there. We got creeped out because we found a mold of someone's teeth up there. It scared us, but we didn't let it get to us too much because we used to store our toys up there. My mum ended up getting a headboard and a bed frame from a lady because my mother wanted to get rid of her waterbed at some stage. And well, a short time later, the lady that my mother got the bed frame from actually died. My mum would accuse me and my brother of peeking into her room in the middle of the night around this time, and we swore that it wasn't us. Then, she said that she would see these solid black shadowy figures as tall as the door frame looking in her room. There were apparently 2 of them. My mum put 2 and 2 together, and her theory was that whatever spirits were in the house didn't like the bed frame because there is possibly a spirit attached to it. She quickly got rid of that bed frame. So it's coming up to Christmas time again, and I get a remote control truck from my grandmother. Well, me and my brother are in our room watching MTV, and the RC truck just starts moving by itself. It drove itself out of my bedroom door and just stopped. My brother smacked me in the head and said to stop playing with it or go downstairs because he's trying to watch TV, probably the Tom Green show. I told him that I wasn't playing with it though, that I had forgot it and left the remote control at my grandmother's house. We looked at each other and he told me to go and get the truck, and so I picked it up and he said take the batteries out of it because it's probably just interference with the cordless or something like that. I don't know, it made sense back then. Well, I opened the bottom and it only has 1 of the 4 AA batteries in it. We got a little bit scared by that, and so I put the truck under my bed, and really that's where it lived for the rest of its life. Now, I got into a little bit of trouble at middle school and had to be homeschooled at one stage. I completely changed my daily schedule, and I would stay up all night talking to people in chat rooms. But we had a web TV, not a PC, and when my brother's alarm clock would go off for him to get up for school, that was my alarm clock to end up going to bed. This was our daily and nightly routine pretty much all school year. And well, in the time that I'm up, the computer room, which is off of the kitchen, and had the laundry room in it, we had a curtain that separated the kitchen from the computer room, and I started noticing that the curtain would move. Not blowing, but crease and move as if someone was using their arm to move it out of the way. Then the laundry room door would open, and then close. And a little while later, the laundry room door would open and close again, the curtain would crease and move again, as if someone was sort of walking back and forth from the kitchen to the laundry room. This went on all school year and into the summer. I ended up naming the spirits or ghosts or demons Heidi and Beth. I have no explanation why I chose those names, but that's what I did. Probably because I knew 2 ladies died, so I gave them female names, I guess, but this was an every night event, so I'd welcome them pretty much every time, like, hey Heidi, hey Beth, and I was never bothered by them, except for them moving the curtain and the door, I guess. I never was touched or anything, not like my mother and brother had allegedly been, but well, summer is here, and my brother decided that he wanted to stay up and see what I do all night, so I introduced him to the world of chat rooms on web TV, Talk City at the time. His first night, he was typing away and chatting it up with someone, and he just sort of stops mid-sentence. He said, "Is my hair moving?" He had a sort of little alfalfa-looking thing on his head. I looked, and his hair was moving, as if someone was flicking it. I said, "No, you're imagining stuff because you haven't ever stayed up this long." Freaked out, I tried to make light of it, and I said, "No, you're imagining stuff because you've never stayed up this long." Anyways, we live our life and share the house with these spirits. Brother gets a girlfriend and moves out. A couple of years later, I move in with my girlfriend. My mum goes downhill, heavy drinking, popping pills until it put her into the hospital in June of 2007. And then in July of the same year, the house actually catches fire. The fire department thought that it was arson, but The paperwork reads that it was undetermined. August of 2007, my mum loses her battle to alcohol, and it was after a 3-month stay in the hospital to liver failure. Only the downstairs of the house was burned. The fire department got it out and put it out pretty quickly. And well, me and my brother decide that we're going to go to the house to see if we left anything salvageable in the attic from our childhood. While in the attic in the closet, in what was supposed to be my room, something just made me start pulling back the insulation up there, and it was then that I actually found a Ouija board with a check from Mr. G to professional ambulance services and a picture of the two ladies. My guess at the time was that it was Mr. G's wife and daughter. My brother was into his emo rocker phase at that stage and decided to have the Ouija board framed and hung it up in his house on the wall above his bed, with the check and the pictures in a sort of Ziploc bag. My older sister works for a heating and air company, loved her boss, did everything for him and his other employees. We have a local dirt track racing where I live and decided to go one day and posted a picture on Facebook. My sister called me and asked if I was there though, and she was apparently in the pits, that her boss races there on the weekends or something. She told him that her bro was there and they got us from the grandstands and took us up to the pits where she introduced him to us. She said, "B, this is my boss, M, and M, this is my bro, B." She also told me that I found out that M is Mr. G's grandson. He built the house that we lived in, apparently. We talked about the house, and he confirmed that it was his grandma and aunt that died there from cancer, and how he stayed there for a while with the dogs that they had and stuff. We didn't really mention it anymore after that, and I started enjoying the weekends with my family at the dirt track, and became affiliated with the race team working on the race cars and everything like that. And well, some time passes, and my brother's wife is diagnosed with cancer, and well, unfortunately, it was too late. She lost her battle to cancer fairly quickly, and my brother came to me a few weeks later and says that he wants to get rid of the Ouija board that he had framed, because he has a feeling that that's why his wife had passed. That apparently he thought that he had brought some bad voodoo stuff into their home. He asked if we could just throw it away or burn it. And well, from my time watching ghost hunters and paranormal shows, I thought that I was a bit of an expert, so I thought and told him that I believe that you can't just get rid of it. You have to release the spirits or something like that. I didn't really know what I was talking about, but it hit me then. Hey, I know someone who might have some answers about it. My brother came over and I called M, my sister's boss. And I said, "Hey Em, I have a bit of a weird question, but back in the day after the house burnt, we decided to snoop in the upstairs attic and we found a Ouija board. Do you know if Mr. G used it?" And then Em said no. I used it. I bought it when I was 14 from the local hobby shop. He said that apparently he had tried to contact his grandma and aunt. I said that I was about to send him a picture, and well, I put the two pictures on the Ouija board and I sent him a picture of it. And he said yes. That's my board, and that's my picture of my grandma, Heidi, and my Aunt Beth. Me and my brother just looked at each other, pale as we could be. Now, if you remember what I said earlier, I mentioned that when I was a teen, I randomly gave the spirits in our house the names Heidi and Beth. And to this day, I still have absolutely no understanding of how that even happened. In the end, I asked if he wanted all of it, and he said yes, so we returned all of his stuff to the original owner, him. And that's pretty much where his story ends. Me and my brother have spoken about it over the years a few times and told the story together to people and family, but still, no one believes us, so we just sort of told each other that we know the truth because we lived through it, and that we'll just have to take it to the grave with us one day. I, a 25-year-old female, live in Seattle, and yesterday I stopped at a gas station in the late afternoon. This station had 2 sets of pumps, one by the storefront and on the main road, and another parallel to the cross street, a bit further away. I parked at the pump in front of the store, and there were no other cars or people around, except for a van parked at the other set of pumps. Now, as soon as I parked, I saw a woman walking from the van and towards the store. It was a rainy, gloomy day, and she was in a floral dress that looked very cutesy and Christian cottagey sort of woman. Hopefully that paints a bit of a picture, but she looked slightly confused and was subtly sort of looking into the window of my car before she approached me after I opened my door. She was seemingly distressed and told me that she had no gas and was stranded, and had to drive 30 miles to get home. I had a bit of an unsettling feeling about the interaction, and told her that I was broke and I didn't have 30 miles of gas of money to help her with. She then said that she didn't want any money, but needed me to come over to the car to help her. She kept repeating that I just needed to come over to the car. I had looked towards the van and noticed that the rear window was completely covered with black tape and the car looked noticeably disheveled. I knew at that point that I would be going nowhere near her car or getting out of mine at all. After refusing her multiple times, she walks back to the van. It was one of those vans with the sliding rear doors, and when she returned, she slid it open slightly and I could see that she was speaking to someone in the back seat. At this point, a Mercedes pulls up to the pump right across from her and a man gets out. She does not approach him at all, and instead, she gets into the front of the van and drives off. Now, I knew from the beginning that everything about this moment felt off, but it wasn't until a few minutes after that the details, they really sunk in and I realized what that could have been. Maybe I'm being dramatic and perhaps it was nothing at all, but I do have good intuition and something just really did not feel right from the beginning of that whole encounter. This happened in Indianapolis, Indiana, roughly around the year 2004 or 2005. My ex-wife and I had our first kid. We were both young, as I was 23 and my wife was 19. At that age, we both wanted our own place, and we decided to get an apartment together. We searched for a few weeks and settled on some brand new apartments that were still in the process of being built. To my knowledge, this wasn't anything but a cornfield beforehand, but I've heard other stories of these apartments being built on old Indian burial grounds. I've never found any proof of this though, and so I'm not really sure. Anyway, during the process of moving in, we would bring our pit bull over to get used to the house and explore a little bit. The first red flag was my pit bull named Phoebe wouldn't go anywhere near the place. She would sit outside the apartment and whine until we would go inside and then start barking. Looking back, it's one of the obvious signs that something paranormal was going on, but that thought just never really crossed my mind at the time. So, after everything is moved in, things seem to be going great. I worked second shift as a waiter and would often pick up hours for a few extra bucks while my wife was in cosmetology school. So after forcing my dog to become acquainted with the apartment, she seemed to be doing fine but refused to go into my son's room. I'll admit too that his room gave me a weird feeling, but as a young man I didn't think too much of it. But everything changed 3 days within being in my new home. So I was off work on a random Tuesday and took my son and dog to the local park for a few hours to just burn off some energy. We got back and my son went and took a nap, or so I thought, because when I went to go and check in on him, he was talking to himself in a full coherent conversation. Not completely abnormal for kids, I know, to make up friends or whatever, so I asked him who he was talking to, and he replied with the scary lady in the corner of the room. as he pointed to the corner of the ceiling. I was a little bit creeped out by this, but I'm a firm believer in letting kids run wild with the imagination. I would ask him questions such as, do you know her name? How old is she? What does she look like? All to no avail, though. All I was told was that she was an older girl who was very mean, apparently. Well, fast forward a few hours later, my wife returns home and we discuss the previous situation and come to an agreement that he's just being a kid, and we went to bed that night. I was awoken by my son, though, screaming and crying in the middle of the night, so I went to go in there and check in on him. And when I went in, he was pointing at the corner of the ceiling again. My dog, though, was also staring at the corner of the room, barking. I wasn't sure what to do, so I took my son in our room and I closed his door, and everything seemed to settle down after that. The next day I go to work. I'm working a double, so I won't be home until a little bit after midnight. I call my wife every break to make sure everything's going well, and it was. But at about 11:30 I received a phone call from her saying the same things from last night are happening again, and I needed to go home at that moment. I tell my boss that I'm having a family emergency and speed as fast as I can back to our home. As I open the door, I hear the chaos going on and go straight to our room, where I find her sitting in the bed with our son. He's crying hysterically. The dog is sprinting back and forth, barking as loud as a dog can bark. My poor wife is crying due to being overwhelmed, so we leave for the night and we end up going to my parents' house. As we're driving there, my son looks at me dead in the eyes and says, "Daddy, she wanted me to tell you that she's a poltergeist." My son is 2, mind you, doesn't even know the word, has never seen or heard any conversation even remotely close to that topic, so I knew then that something weird was going on and that this wasn't all bull. We returned to the apartment the next day, and my whole house is as if it has been just completely turned upside down. My son's dresser is on the floor, all the clothes are spread out all over the room, the toy box was empty and every toy that we had was scattered around, his crib was vertical up against a wall, and it was that day that we decided that it was time to move out. Honestly, I get a bit teary-eyed even sharing this because it feels like I just haven't and cannot begin to process this whole thing. And it happened like 20 years ago now. Later that year, he actually walked in on my wife and I watching The Grudge at one stage. He dropped down to the floor though and instantly started crying and saying that apparently that was the woman that he had seen. I've always been a believer in the paranormal, or at least wanted to, but this experience made me look at life differently. Not only because my whole family was traumatized by this event, but because you just never know what's truly scary until you're up against a force that you cannot even see. This is an ongoing situation, and I'm really not sure what to do about it. So my house sits fairly far back from the road, around maybe 150 feet, roughly, maybe a little bit further to be honest, but between the entrance to my driveway and my front porch, I have 3 vehicles parked that would obscure the view from anyone walking or driving by. I live in the country, on a side road with no stores or anything along it, or nearby even, so someone getting lost looking for an address or something out here is pretty unlikely. What I mean is that there's really no reason to be here at all, unless you know someone, and while the roads are a couple of miles long, there's only 6 houses on it because it's an agricultural area with wide gaps between neighbors. No streetlights either, literally almost pitch black out there at night. Now, about a week ago, I was waiting for the mum of the boy that I sit for to come and pick him up. It was still pretty light out, it was about 7 p.m, so it was just starting to get dimmer outside. When the kid's mum came in to get him, She and I were talking outside the car for a minute while he was finishing a match on Apex when we both heard a noise that sounded like someone trying to stifle a cough from in the kiwi orchard bordering my house. I thought that it was her kid at first because he tries to jump scare me all the time lately, despite stealth not exactly being in his wheelhouse, so coughing or laughing when he's setting up to try and get me and giving away his position is a pretty common thing at the moment. So I pretty much paid exactly zero attention to it at first. Well, a couple of minutes later, he came flying out of my room and they left, and I didn't even realize until later that was weird because who the heck was coughing in the orchard? But at that time it was just, I don't know. I didn't even register, I guess. Well, later that night I was sitting outside on my front porch just smoking. It was somewhere between midnight and like 1 in the morning. My lighter was dead, so I lit my cigarette in the house on my stove and then ran outside with it. I was sitting with my back to the road smoking. I had no porch lights on. My phone was on the dimmest screen setting because I didn't want to entice the mosquitoes that were already out there. And well, about halfway through smoking, a man spoke up from somewhere near me and asked if he could have a cigarette. It surprised me so much that I instantly just froze. Literally thought that an ad had popped up in the background tab on my phone or something. And then he said it again. So I turned around and he was right behind me. This dude was tall as well, like really tall. Somewhere between like 6'3" and 6'6" at least. Beard, long hair, barefoot, wearing maybe blue or grey pants and no shirt, and a long coat or robe. Kind of hard to tell in the dark, even though I had turned on my phone flashlight and he was 5 or 6 feet away from me. At most. Like 2 steps and he would have had his hands on me. I didn't know what to do or say. Like, my heart was pounding so fast that I pulled out of my pack, and when he started to step forward I said, "No, stop. You don't need to do that here." And I just tossed him the whole thing. When I told him to stop, he did, but like weird. He stopped and put his hands up to his chest height, palms out, and said that was a good idea to toss it, and then just stood there for a second. I literally didn't know what to say, and before I even had a chance to, this weird guy just backed away, like he literally walked backwards, back towards the road, to where I could no longer see him. I didn't hear footsteps after that, so I don't know if he kept walking or just stopped, but I also have no clue how the heck he got so close to me like that, or where he even came from, or how he even knew that I was smoking unless he was nearby enough to smell it, or something like that, because it's not like he heard me light it. I mean, I lit it inside, or how I've never seen him around at all. But it gets worse because I've heard noises around my house every single night since then. Not like right up on my house or where my cameras would catch him, but like noises in the orchard, near the canal, too close for comfort for sure. Really, I'm just not sure what to do. I asked the sheriff to patrol out here if they could, but they're almost never out this way, and I cannot exactly report him if I don't know where he is, or if he's actually doing anything to be reported for. It obviously creeped me the heck out, and I have a weird feeling about that dude, but really I just don't know what I can do about it, which is why I'm here. What do you guys think that I should do? Before I begin, I just want to say that this isn't my family's first ever paranormal activity experience. We're from Mexico, and in our old home my parents describe everything that they've seen and heard, from footsteps and furniture moved at night, to seeing a woman in a white gown walking across a room just feet from them. Obviously, that's a story for another day, but this one that I'm about to share is new. So we moved into a new house in VA last November. We're renting for 2 years. The place seems normal, and we've only had one semi-paranormal event, which was about a week ago, but now it's two. So I was watching some YouTube videos on TV in the living room. It's me and our 3 dogs in the living room downstairs, my nephew, 4 years old, and my mum in their bedroom upstairs. I paused the TV and went upstairs to get a jacket to walk my dog. I open my parents' room door and ask my mum if I can head out for a few, and she tells me yes, but then tells me to come inside. I go in and she asks our nephew, in Spanish, "What did you see?" He then answers, "There was a man in the closet, and he walked out and he was gone, and he's not there, but he was there." Confused, I looked into the dark closet, which has the door opened, like normal, and walked into it. But there was nothing human-shaped there, and I've seen this kid's YouTube history. The closest that he's seen to a ghost video is videos about a slide eater. I called his mum, and she just chalked it up to him seeing stuff with a high imagination. Now yes, he has an active imagination like all kids do, as I've certainly seen him play out stories in his head when we play at the park, but never something that would actively scare him like this. But honestly though, it wasn't even that he was really scared, it was more like he was confused on what he had seen. I really don't know what to think of it. I mean, on one hand he's a kid and you just cannot really trust them, but on the other hand he's never really said anything like this or lied without a reason in general. He wouldn't say something that would scare himself, and I just cannot bring myself to believe that he'd imagined something like that. And it doesn't seem like he's just looking into the dark side of the room and imagined it, since he was on his iPad since the moment that I walked into the room. He was sitting on a revolving seat and, while scared, wasn't trying to hide or anything, just sort of keeping close with my mum, who was showering at the time. Anyway, I would love to hear your ideas, explanations, and any kind of weapon against the paranormal, because I really am not taking any chances here. After all, I live like less than 40 steps from that closet. This happened a few years ago, and really I still cannot make any sense of it. I don't know if it was exhaustion, alcohol, or, I don't know, something else entirely, but it still unsettles me when I think about it. So I was staying at my parents' house, in a separate studio space that used to be a garage before they renovated it. It was winter, but the room was heated. I had a little bit of wine earlier in the night, not enough to be drunk, just enough to feel a little bit tired. It was around 2 a.m, and I was on the phone with my boyfriend at the time, talking about life and trying to just clear my head a bit. The room was pitch black, no nightlights, no glow from the street, just total darkness. At some point though, I laid down on the carpet while we talked, sort of exhausted. And that's when I noticed something beside me on the floor. It looked like a pillow, but I couldn't see much, just a dark, soft-looking shape next to me. Without thinking, I sort of rolled over and wrapped my arms around it, and instantly something was wrong. The best way that I can describe it is that the entire atmosphere shifted in a second. The room, which had been warm, suddenly felt colder. Not a draft, mind you, not my imagination. The air itself felt different, and this feeling sort of came over me, like a wave of deep, heavy sadness. Not my own sadness, but something else. It wasn't gradual, it wasn't subtle. It hit me all at once, like flipping a switch. 1 second I was tired but fine. The next it was like something dark had wrapped itself around me, like I had stepped into something that I wasn't supposed to touch. I shot up and ran out of the room. My heart was racing. I felt sick, like I had brushed up against something that I shouldn't have. The next morning, I went back trying to make sense of any of it, and there was nothing there. No pillow, no blanket, nothing in that spot at all. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if my brain just glitched, if I was just too exhausted or if something else was in that room with me. But I know how it felt, like I had touched something that didn't want to be touched. Has anyone ever experienced something like this? What could I have felt? Was this some kind of sleep deprivation, hallucination, or was there actually something there? I really need some answers. So last year in September of 2024, I ventured up to the Hoko Azet Road near the Blue Canyon area to set up some trail cameras. My goal was to capture footage of wildlife, bears, cougars, bobcats, or any notable deer. After scouting for the perfect spot, I found a small pull-off along the road and made my way about a mile into the dense woods, following various game trails. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of moss and damp foliage. Along the way, I gathered a bunch of chanterelle mushrooms, adding a pleasant bonus to my outing. I eventually found an ideal location, a flat area with good visibility in both directions along a well-used game trail. The forest canopy allowed only slivers of sunlight to break through, casting shifting shadows on the ground. I set up 3 trail cameras, ensuring each was on video mode before securing my gear and heading back to my truck. Now, a few weeks later, I returned to check the footage. The forest was just as I had left it, silent and undisturbed. To my surprise, 2 of the cameras had captured nothing at all, while the third had recorded only 4 pictures instead of video. The SD card felt ice cold in my hand as I loaded the images into my laptop in the truck. The first image, it showed nothing but trees and brush. The second revealed a woman in a long flowing gown, standing eerily still, clutching an old-fashioned doll in her arms. The fabric of her dress appeared tattered and her face was obscured by the shadow of her hair. The third image was even more unsettling. She was now facing the camera directly, her lifeless eyes locked onto the lens, the doll held firmly against her chest. The fourth and final picture, it had returned to the empty forest scene, as if she had just simply vanished. A cold shiver ran down my spine upon seeing this. This area, it's remote. No one should have known where I placed my cameras, let alone been wandering around alone in the woods at that hour. I hiked back to the location where she appeared in the pictures, yet I found no footprints other than my own. The undergrowth was undisturbed, as if no one had even stood there. I took the SD card home and I transferred the images to my laptop, not realizing that this simple act would invite something into my life. That night, I began experiencing strange occurrences. I saw shadowy figures moving through my home, heard footsteps echoing in empty hallways, and felt an eerie presence lingering just outside of my vision, as if something was watching me. Determined to get some answers, I decided to return to the site, better prepared this time. This time I brought additional trail cameras, perimeter alarms, and chem lights. I set up my hammock in the center of a protective ring of cameras and alarms, carefully marking an exit route. The forest felt heavier this time, as if it knew that I was there. My plan was to stay overnight and witness whatever it was that was out there firsthand. As darkness settled in, the woods fell into an eerie silence. Not even the usual nighttime sounds of crickets and owls filled the air. Armed with night vision scope, I kept watch, scanning the surrounding trees for movement. The hours, they passed uneventfully, until just after midnight, when everything changed. A rapid succession of deafening booms filled the air, relentless and overwhelming. My immediate thought was gunfire, an attempt to scare me off perhaps. But as I took a breath and assessed the situation, I realized something far more disturbing. Every single one of my perimeter alarms, they had all triggered at once. A deep, primal fear took hold suddenly. My hair stood on end as I grabbed my pack and rifle, heading for my exit point. I didn't walk, I ran. The thick brush clawed at me as I sprinted through sticker bushes, stumbling and falling multiple times. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare slow down. My only focus was reaching my truck now. Bursting through the patch of ferns, I suddenly found myself tumbling into a ditch, chest deep into the cold earth. The scent of damp soil filled my nose as I clawed my way out, my pulse hammering in my ears. Finally, through the darkness, I saw my truck gleaming under the moonlight. I reached for the door handle, and that's when everything went black. The next thing that I knew is that I was sitting in the driver's seat. My pack and rifle, which I always stored behind the driver's seat, were inexplicably behind the passenger seat. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. I quickly checked, and 3 whole hours had passed. Yet I have no memory of anything about what had happened. Shaken to my core, I sped home and I immediately collapsed into sleep. The exhaustion was overwhelming for me, and it was honestly as if I had run for miles. A few days later, I returned one last time to retrieve my remaining equipment. The air felt oppressive, as if the forest itself was warning me to leave. After removing everything from that spot, the strange occurrences at my house, they just suddenly stopped. The shadowy figures, the footsteps, the eerie presence, all gone, just like that. To this day, I don't know who or what appeared on my trail cam, but I do know one thing. I certainly won't be going back to that spot ever again.